Good evening, and welcome back to Sleep into Power, guys. Wherever you are tonight, whatever hour it happens to be where you are lying, I am very glad you found your way here. Somewhere in the world it is late evening and the curtains have just been drawn. Somewhere else the sun came up hours ago, and someone is working a night shift with headphones in, stealing a little quiet from a long day. It does not matter which of those you are. You are welcome here all the same, and there is no hurry at all in anything that follows. Tonight we are going to sea. We are going to spend the next few hours drifting through the age of sail, through warm green water and coral shallows, through harbors that smelled of tar and rum and rotting fruit, and through the strange, brief, brilliant window of history that we now call the Golden Age of Piracy. We will meet Edward Teach, the man the world remembers as Blackbeard, and we will try to separate the man from the legend that grew around him like weed on a hull. We will meet Bartholomew Roberts, who took more ships than any pirate of his generation and drank tea while he did it. We will meet Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose lives are so improbable that historians still argue about how much of their story is true. We will walk through the sand streets of Nassau when it belonged to no government on earth, and we will end, as all of it ended, with the sea going quiet again. Before we set off, a few gentle things, and then I will not interrupt you again. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys through history, it genuinely helps if you press the like button and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that quiet documentaries still have a place in the world. If you would like to take a little of this with you into your waking hours, there is a book called Sleep into Power, available on Amazon in paperback and on Kindle. It is about rest, and about what happens to a life when you stop fighting the night. If you prefer to listen without a screen, the whole channel is on Spotify, so you can put your phone face down and simply listen in the dark. There is a second channel too, Meditate into Power, for the nights when you want stillness rather than stories. And if you ever feel like supporting the work directly, there is a Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Every single one of those is read and appreciated more than I can properly say. Tonight's subject came from a request. You know who you are. Thank you for it, because this one has been a pleasure to write. Now, settle in properly. Loosen your shoulders. Let your jaw unclench, because it probably is clenched. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head rather than half of it. You do not need to remember any of what follows. You do not need to stay awake for the ending. If you drift off somewhere around the coast of Hispaniola and never learn what happened at Ocracoke Inlet, that is a success, not a failure. The waves will keep going without you. Let us begin where every story of the Caribbean has to begin, which is with the water itself. There is a sea here that is not one color but a dozen, changing with the depth beneath it. Over the deep trenches, it is an ink blue so dark it looks almost violet at dusk. Over the sand shelves it turns a pale, luminous turquoise, so clear that a ship at anchor seems to hover in the air rather than float, its shadow moving across the seabed 30 feet below like a slow cloud. Over the reefs, it goes green and busy and dappled. The light here has a particular quality that sailors from Northern Europe found difficult to describe when they first saw it. They had grown up with the grey Atlantic and the brown Channel and the cold North Sea, water that hid whatever lay in it. Here the sea gave everything away. The Caribbean is a basin roughly 2,500 kilometers across, ringed by islands that curve down from Florida in a long, broken arc towards the shoulder of South America. To the north sit the great islands, Cuba and Hispaniola and Jamaica and Puerto Rico, wide enough to hold mountains and rivers and their own weather. To the east, the arc thins into the Lesser Antilles, a scattering of volcanic peaks and low coral platforms, some of them so small that a man could walk their length before breakfast. Between them run channels and passages, some deep and easy, others treacherous with reef and current. And it is those passages, more than anything else, that would eventually make piracy possible. A narrow gap between islands is a place where ships must go. Where ships must go, other ships can wait. The winds here are extraordinarily reliable. From roughly the northeast, the trade winds blow across the whole basin for most of the year, steady enough that a sailing master could plan a voyage around them, the way you might plan a journey around a train timetable. They arrive warm and salt-heavy and constant, rattling the palms along every windward shore, and they never quite stop. On a still night at anchor, you can hear them working through the rigging above you, a low, continuous note that changes pitch as the ship swings on her cable. Sailors slept to that sound for 4 centuries. There is a reason so many people still find it restful. Beneath the wind runs the current, pushing west and then north, curling up through the Yucatan Channel and out past Cuba into the Straits of Florida, gathering speed until it becomes the Gulf Stream and carries warm water all the way to Europe. Everything in the Caribbean moves in that direction. Ships, weather, seeds, birds, and eventually silver. To sail east against it was slow and miserable work. To sail west with it was almost effortless. That simple asymmetry shaped where towns were built, where fleets sheltered, and where, in time, men with black flags chose to lie in wait. And then there is the hurricane season, which runs roughly from June to November, and which every person who ever lived in these waters organized their year around. For most of that period, the sky is benign, but a Caribbean sky can change in a way that northern skies do not. The swell arrives before the storm, long and oily and wrong, rolling in from a horizon that still looks perfectly clear. The birds go quiet. The air becomes strangely heavy. Experienced sailors learn to read those signs the way a farmer reads a field, and when they read them correctly, they ran for shelter, for a deep bay or a river mouth or the lee of a high island, and they waited. When they read them wrongly, or when they were too far from land, they died. The seabed of the Caribbean is scattered with the results. Long before any European saw this sea, people lived on it and in it and from it. The Taino had spread through the Greater Antilles over centuries, arriving in canoes from the South American mainland, moving island to island up the arc. Their villages sat near fresh water and good landing beaches, clusters of round thatched houses around an open plaza, with cassava gardens on the slopes behind. They played a ball game on rectangular courts edged with stone. They carved wood and shell into figures of remarkable delicacy, and they moved between islands with a confidence that European sailors, at first, found hard to credit. A Taino canoe could be 50 feet long, cut from a single trunk, and carried dozens of people. Further south and east lived the Kalinago, whom the Spanish called Caribs, and from whom the sea itself eventually took its name. A people with their own languages, their own seagoing tradition, and a reputation for resisting invasion that would prove entirely justified. We should be honest that we know less about these societies than we would like, and that much of what was written about them was written by the people who destroyed them. Spanish chroniclers had reasons to describe the Taino as gentle and the Kalinago as ferocious, because the categories justified different policies towards each. Archaeology has complicated both pictures considerably in recent decades. What is not in doubt is that the islands were populated, cultivated, connected by trade and travel, and had been for a very long time before anything with a square sail appeared over the eastern horizon. Consider one of those evenings, sometime in the 1480s, the sun going down behind a volcanic ridge on an island that will later be called Guadeloupe, smoke rising thin and straight from cooking fires, children in the shallows, the reef breaking white a quarter-mile out, a low, continuous rumble that has been the background sound of this place for as long as the coral has been there. Frigate birds hanging in the last of the thermals, barely moving. Somebody hauling a canoe higher up the sand. The light going from gold to rose to that deep, transparent blue that comes just before proper dark. And then the stars, more stars than most modern people have ever seen, laid across the whole sky from horizon to horizon, with the Milky Way standing up through the middle of them like spilled sugar. That is the world as it was. Hold that image for a moment, because everything that follows in this story happens on top of it. The buccaneers, the treasure fleets, the plantations, the black flags, the trials and the hangings. All of it takes place in that same warm water under those same stars. The sea did not change, only what floated on it did. And on an October morning in 1492, on a small island in what we now call the Bahamas, 3 Spanish ships came out of the east. Christopher Columbus was not looking for the Caribbean. He was looking for Asia, and he was working from a calculation of the Earth's circumference that was badly, almost comically wrong. Nearly every trained cosmographer in Portugal had told him so. The distance west from the Canaries to Japan was far greater than he believed, and had there been no land in between, he and every man with him would have starved somewhere in the middle of an empty ocean. He was saved by an error in his own reasoning and by the accident of 2 continents lying exactly where he had assumed there would be water. The landfall came in the small hours of the 12th of October. A lookout on the Pinta, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, saw pale cliffs or pale sand in the moonlight and called out. They shortened sail and waited for dawn rather than risk the reefs in darkness, which was sensible seamanship, and which also gave them several hours to stand on deck and stare at a shoreline nobody aboard could name. What island it was remains genuinely uncertain. Historians have argued for at least half a dozen candidates in the Bahamas, and the debate has never been settled to everyone's satisfaction, because Columbus's own log survives only in a later abridgment, and the sailing directions in it can be made to fit several places. What happened next is easier to trace and much harder to read. Within a generation, the Taino population of the Greater Antilles collapsed. The causes were multiple, and they compounded one another. Smallpox and measles and influenza arrived in populations with no prior exposure and moved through them with terrible speed. The encomienda system placed communities under Spanish overseers and demanded labor, particularly gold panning, in quantities that broke the agricultural cycle and left people undernourished at exactly the moment they most needed to be strong. Families were broken apart. Estimates of the pre-contact population vary enormously, from a few 100,000 to several million, and any honest account has to say that we do not know the figure. What is not in question is the scale of the loss. Within 50 years, the societies that had built those ball courts and carved those figures had effectively ceased to exist as independent entities, though Taino ancestry, language and agriculture persisted in ways that are only now being properly recognized. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because a great deal of what follows in this story is downstream of it. The Caribbean that pirates operated in was not an empty stage. It was a place that had already been emptied, and then refilled, by force. Gold was what the Spanish came for first, and the islands did not have much of it. The rivers of Hispaniola yielded enough to be tantalizing, and never enough to be transformative. But in the 1520s, Hernán Cortés brought down the Mexica Empire in central Mexico, and in the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro did something similar to the Inca in Peru, and suddenly, Spain was in possession of 2 of the richest mining regions on the planet. Then came Potosí. High in the Andes, in what is now Bolivia, at an altitude of over 4,000 meters, where the air is thin enough to make walking uncomfortable, there stands a cone-shaped mountain called Cerro Rico, Rich Hill. In 1545, it was found to contain silver in almost unbelievable concentration. A town grew at its foot with astonishing speed, and by the early 17th century, Potosí had a population comparable to London or Paris. 160,000 people, living in a place where nothing grows, everything must be carried up, and the nights are bitterly cold. The silver came out of that mountain on the backs of forced laborers. The Spanish adapted an existing Andean rotational labor obligation, the mita, into something far harsher, requiring indigenous communities across a vast region to send a proportion of their men to Potosi for shifts underground. Men descended by rope and notched log ladders into tunnels lit by tallow candles, worked in heat and bad air, and carried ore up on their backs, in loads that would be considered criminal in any modern jurisdiction. The refining process used mercury, brought from Huancavelica, and mercury poisoning did what mercury poisoning does. Enslaved Africans were brought in as well, particularly to the refining mills. Nobody kept an honest count of the dead. The phrase that survives in Spanish for something enormously valuable is still to be worth a Potosi, and it is worth remembering what that value was made of. That silver had to get to Spain, and getting it to Spain meant crossing the Caribbean. The system the Spanish built to do this was one of the great logistical achievements of the early modern world, and also one of its great vulnerabilities. Twice a year, in theory, convoys sailed. The flota went to Veracruz in Mexico. The galleones went to Cartagena and Portobello on the mainland coast, where the Peruvian silver arrived after being carried up the Pacific side and then hauled across the Isthmus of Panama by mule train. Both fleets then converged on Havana. Havana was chosen for reasons that any sailor would understand immediately. Its harbor is a deep bag of water reached through a narrow entrance, easy to defend and almost impossible to be blown out of. It sits exactly where a ship needs to be in order to catch the Gulf Stream north, through the Florida Straits, and then the westerlies east across the Atlantic. Everything about the geography said that the treasure of two continents should be gathered in this one place before making its run home. So twice a year, Havana filled up. The harbor would be crowded to the point of absurdity, hulls nudging hulls, a forest of masts against the low green hills, boats going back and forth all day with water casks and firewood, and salt beef and biscuit. Ashore, the town swelled with sailors and soldiers and merchants and officials, and everyone who makes a living from the presence of men with money and time. Taverns overflowed, prices tripled, priests preached against the drinking and were ignored, and in the fortified counting houses, clerks with ink-stained fingers worked through the night registering chests, because the crown took its fifth of everything, and the accounting had to be exact. At night, it must have been quite something to see. Hundreds of stern lanterns burning across black water, the reflections stretching and breaking as the swell came through the entrance. Bells sounding the watches from a dozen ships slightly out of time with one another, so that the hour arrived in a long, ragged sequence rather than all at once. Somebody singing badly on a nearby deck. The smell of the place, which would have been tar and hemp and wood smoke and roasting meat, and the deep organic sweetness of tropical rot that hangs over every harbor in that latitude. And then, on the right morning, with the right wind, they would go. 40 ships, 50, sometimes more, warping out through the narrows one by one, setting topsails in the fairway, forming up outside in a loose crescent with the heavy galleons in the center and the fast escorts out on the wings. From the fortress walls you could watch them for hours as they diminished eastward and northward, until the last topgallant dropped below the horizon, and Havana went quiet again for another 6 months. Somewhere out beyond that horizon, almost from the beginning, other people were watching too. Because here is the thing about the Spanish system. It was extraordinarily rich, extraordinarily predictable, and defended by a state that had claimed, on the basis of a papal ruling in 1493, and the treaty that followed it, exclusive rights to almost everything west of a line in the Atlantic. France and England and later the Dutch Republic did not accept that claim for a moment. As the French King Francis I is supposed to have remarked, he would very much like to see the clause in Adam's will that divided the world between Spain and Portugal. The remark may well be apocryphal. The attitude behind it certainly was not. So the treasure fleets sailed through waters full of people who regarded them as fair game, and the entire apparatus of the Caribbean, the fortresses at Havana and Cartagena and San Juan, the convoy system itself, the garrisons and the guardacostas, and the endless correspondence between colonial governors and a distant court, existed because of that fact. The Spanish Main was the richest sea lane in the world, and it was under attack for 200 years before the men we call pirates ever raised a black flag. Which brings us, gently, to the difference between a pirate and a privateer. It is a distinction that matters enormously, and it is thinner than you might expect. A privateer was a private ship licensed by a government to attack the shipping of a named enemy in time of war. The license was called a letter of marque, and it was, in essence, a piece of paper that turned robbery into policy. The privateer kept most of what he took, after the crown and the investors had their share. The state got a navy it did not have to pay for. A pirate was a man doing the same thing without the paper. That is the whole of the legal distinction, and once you see it clearly, a great deal of this history becomes easier to follow. The same man, in the same ship, with the same crew, could be a lawful privateer in March and a hanging offense in June, because a treaty had been signed in a European palace he would never see, and news of it had finally crossed the Atlantic. Careers slid back and forth across that line constantly. A very large proportion of the famous pirates of the Golden Age began as privateers and turned to piracy when peace made them redundant. It is one of the central facts of the whole story. The English started early. In the 1560s, John Hawkins ran a series of voyages that combined trade, slaving, and intimidation along the Spanish Main, selling enslaved Africans to colonists who were forbidden by their own government to buy them, and who bought them anyway. On the third of these voyages, at San Juan de Ulua, near Veracruz, in 1568, a Spanish fleet trapped him in harbor and destroyed most of his squadron. 2 ships escaped. One was commanded by Hawkins's young cousin, Francis Drake. Drake spent the rest of his life making Spain regret that escape. In 1572, he took 2 small ships and around 70 men to the Isthmus of Panama, where he made contact with the Cimarrones, communities of escaped enslaved Africans living independently in the forest, who had no love for the Spanish and excellent knowledge of the mule trails. With their help, he ambushed a silver train coming up from the Pacific side. There was more silver than his men could physically lift. They buried what they could not carry, which is one of the very few genuine instances of pirates burying treasure in the whole of the historical record. And even then, it was a temporary measure rather than a secret hoard, and the Spanish dug most of it up almost immediately. It was on that expedition that Drake climbed a tall tree on the spine of the isthmus and became one of the first Englishmen to see the Pacific. He is said to have prayed to sail an English ship on that sea. 7 years later he did exactly that, going round the bottom of South America and up the undefended Pacific coast, where nobody had ever thought to fortify anything, taking a treasure ship called Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, so laden with silver that the transfer took 6 days, and then continuing west around the world. He came home in 1580 with a return on investment that has been estimated at several thousand%. Elizabeth I knighted him on the deck of his own ship. The Spanish ambassador was, understandably, incandescent. To Spain, Drake was El Drake, the dragon, a criminal of the first order. To England, he was a hero. Both descriptions were accurate. That doubleness runs right through this subject and never really resolves. But the men who would matter most for the story of Caribbean piracy were not gentlemen adventurers with royal backing. They were something considerably stranger, and they came out of the forests of a large island that Spain had largely stopped bothering with. Hispaniola, the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, had been the center of the first Spanish colony in the Americas. By the early 1600s, it was a backwater. The gold was gone, the indigenous population had collapsed, and the wealth of the empire had moved to the mainland. The Spanish concentrated in the southeast around Santo Domingo and effectively abandoned the north and west of the island. What they left behind was cattle and pigs, descendants of the animals brought over a century earlier, now running wild in enormous numbers through the savanna and the scrub. Into that emptiness drifted men, shipwrecked sailors, deserters, runaway indentured servants, mostly French, who had signed 3-year contracts in exchange for passage and found the reality closer to slavery than employment. Escaped enslaved Africans, religious refugees, men who had committed something in Europe that made returning unwise. They gathered in small bands along the north coast of Hispaniola and on the little turtle-shaped island just off it, Tortuga, and they made a living hunting. They dried the meat over slow green wood fires on a wooden frame that the Taino had called a barbacoa, and the French rendering of a related word gave the process the name boucan. Men who did this were boucaniers, buccaneers. Their lives were rough beyond easy description. They dressed in hide and canvas, stiff and black with dried blood and grease, and the smell of them was legendary. A French missionary called Père Labat, who spent years in the islands and wrote one of the liveliest accounts we have of Caribbean life in this period, described them without much admiration and considerable fascination. They carried long-barreled muskets made in Dieppe and Nantes specifically for this trade, and they were, by every contemporary account, phenomenal marksmen. They worked in pairs bound by an arrangement called matelotage, a partnership in which 2 men shared everything: property, earnings, and inheritance if one of them died. Historians have argued about what else matelotage may have involved, and the honest answer is that the sources do not tell us, and that reading a modern category back onto it is speculation rather than evidence. They hunted with packs of half-wild dogs. They slept in hammocks, slung between trees under mosquito nets of coarse cloth. They ate meat and more meat, roasted on the boucan, washed down with whatever alcohol they could get. They had almost no possessions and almost no hierarchy. Decisions were made by argument until everyone agreed or the dissenters left. The Spanish authorities regarded them as vermin and periodically tried to exterminate them, most effectively by slaughtering the wild cattle to destroy their food supply. That policy had a consequence nobody had thought through. Deprived of hunting, the buccaneers turned to the only other resource available, which was the sea and the shipping on it. They started small. A canoe or a small open boat, a dozen men, coming alongside a Spanish coasting vessel at first light and shooting the helmsman before anyone properly understood what was happening. Those marksmen who could drop a running bull at 100 paces could clear a quarterdeck with terrifying efficiency. Having taken a small vessel, they used it to take a bigger one. Having taken a bigger one, they went further. Tortuga became their base, and it is worth taking a moment to see it. It is a small island about 20 miles long, lying a few miles off the northwest coast of Hispaniola, shaped, if you use some imagination, like a turtle floating on the surface. The southern side has a harbor called Bassa Terre, sheltered and reachable, with a shelf of flat ground behind it, and then cliffs rising steeply. The northern side is almost sheer and almost unlandable. It was, in other words, a natural fortress, and it changed hands repeatedly through the middle decades of the century, between French, English, and Spanish claimants, each of whom found the resident population difficult to govern and impossible to remove. By the 1650s, Tortuga had become something recognizable to anyone who has ever seen a frontier town. There was a fort on the height above the harbor. There were warehouses. There were taverns, which is putting it grandly, since most were thatched sheds with a plank counter and barrels. There were French merchants who bought hides and stolen cargo without asking difficult questions, and sold powder, shot, brandy, and cloth at prices that reflected the absence of competition. Ships careened on the beach, hove down on their sides with their bottoms exposed, men working through the cooler hours scraping weed and burning off barnacles with flaming torches of palm, then paying the seams with tallow and tar. There were dogs everywhere. There were women, though far fewer than men, and the French colonial authorities at one point shipped several dozen out from Europe in an attempt to make the settlement more stable, an initiative recorded with a certain bleak comedy in the sources. And on a calm evening, the whole place would go soft. The heat would come out of the day. Cooking fires would start up along the strand. The rendered fat would spit, and the smoke would carry the smell of it out over the water. Men would sit on upturned boats and drink, and argue about a voyage. Behind them, the cliffs would go from green to grey to black. The lights of the anchored ships would come on one by one, and out past the point, in the channel between Tortuga and Hispaniola, the trade wind would keep pushing the swell west the way it always had, endlessly, patiently, entirely indifferent to what anyone on the beach intended to do about the Spanish Empire. By the 1660s, these men had a name for themselves, the Brethren of the Coast. It was less an organization than a loose understanding, a set of customs about how a voyage was agreed, how plunder was divided, how an injured man was compensated. Those customs are the direct ancestors of the pirate articles of the Golden Age 50 years later, and they are the reason the pirate ship became, briefly and imperfectly, one of the more egalitarian workplaces in the Atlantic world. We know about them mostly through one book, and that book requires a note of caution. In 1678, a book appeared in Amsterdam called The American Sea Rovers, written by a man named Alexandre Olivier Exquemelin. He had come out to Tortuga as an indentured servant of the French West India Company, had been sold on to a cruel master and then to a kinder one, had trained as a barber surgeon, and had sailed with the buccaneers for several years in that capacity. He was there. He saw a great deal of it himself. His book was an immediate sensation and was translated into German, Spanish, English, and French within a decade, each translator adding, removing, and adjusting according to national taste. The English edition softened certain things, the Spanish edition sharpened others. Modern historians treat Exquemelin as indispensable and unreliable in roughly equal measure. He records cruelties in detail that other sources corroborate. He also repeats stories he cannot have witnessed, and clearly enjoys a good one. When he is the only source for something, and he often is, the careful position is to say so, rather than to state it as fact. He is, however, our best window into the buccaneer world, and the world he describes is not romantic. It is a world of men who tortured prisoners for information about hidden valuables, who sacked towns and held citizens for ransom, who drank away in a fortnight what they had spent months and lives acquiring. It is also a world of men who had been treated appallingly by the societies they came from, and who had built, out of necessity, a rough system of mutual obligation that looked after its wounded better than the Royal Navy did. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. While Tortuga was becoming a French buccaneer haven, the English acquired something considerably better. In 1655, an English expedition sent by Oliver Cromwell to seize Hispaniola failed embarrassingly, was repelled with heavy losses, and then, rather than return home to explain itself, went and took Jamaica instead, as a consolation prize. It turned out to be one of the most consequential accidents in Caribbean history. Jamaica is a beautiful island, 140 miles long, with the Blue Mountains rising over 7,000 feet along its eastern spine, high enough to be cool and often wrapped in cloud, so that from the coast the summits appear and disappear through the day. Rivers run down through limestone gorges. The northern coast has beaches of pale sand under sea grape and coconut. The interior, in those days, was heavily forested, and in the wild limestone country of the cockpits, there were communities of Maroons, people who had escaped enslavement under Spanish and later English rule, and who maintained their independence in that broken terrain for generations, eventually forcing the British to sign treaties with them. At the southern side, a long spit of sand curls out to enclose one of the finest natural harbors in the world. At the end of that spit, the English built a town, and they called it Port Royal. Port Royal is one of the great vanished cities. At its height in the 1680s, it had perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 people crammed onto a sandspit, with brick houses of 2 and 3 stories standing shoulder to shoulder along narrow streets, warehouses, wharves, 4 forts, several churches, a Jewish synagogue, a Quaker meeting house, and, by one frequently repeated estimate, 1 drinking establishment for every 10 inhabitants. That figure comes from a period document and may be an exaggeration by a scandalized observer. But nobody who wrote about the place disputed the general picture. It was rich. It was rich because it was the market where the buccaneers sold what they had taken, and because it was a slave trading port, and because it was the point at which English manufactured goods entered the Spanish colonial economy through channels that were technically illegal and universally practiced. Merchants in Port Royal handled silver by weight. Goldsmiths worked there. A sailor coming ashore with a share from a successful voyage could spend, in a week, more than an English farm laborer earned in a decade, and the entire town was organized around helping him do it. The Reverend John Taylor, who visited in the 1680s, wrote about it with obvious discomfort and equally obvious fascination. Later writers gave it the nickname the wickedest city on earth, which is a phrase that has done a great deal of work in tourist brochures and rather less in serious scholarship, but the underlying picture holds. It was a boom town on a sandbar, and it behaved like one. And into that town, in the 1660s, walked a Welshman named Henry Morgan. Morgan is a difficult figure to write about at sleep pace, because his career is essentially a sequence of audacious military operations, and I have promised you that we are not making a thriller. So let us take him slowly, and let us be clear about what he actually was. Morgan was not a pirate in his own understanding, and mostly not in law. He operated under commissions from the governors of Jamaica, who issued them because Jamaica was a small, underdefended English colony sitting in the middle of a Spanish sea, and because a fleet of buccaneers, willing to attack Spanish possessions for their own profit, was the cheapest defense available. Whether those commissions were valid at any given moment depended on whether England and Spain were at war, and communications were slow enough that the answer was often no by the time anyone acted on it. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional organizer. His talent was not swordsmanship. It was logistics, intelligence, and the ability to hold together a force of several hundred violently independent men, long enough to complete an operation. He gathered fleets by sending word around the taverns and anchorages, and men came because his voyages paid. At Portobello, in 1668, he took a fortified town by landing well away from it and coming in overland at night, avoiding the guns entirely. At Maracaibo the following year, he found himself trapped inside a lagoon by Spanish warships blocking the narrow entrance, and got out by sending in a fireship disguised as a fighting vessel, with logs dressed in clothes and hats propped along the rail to look like a crew, and then slipping past in the confusion. As a piece of improvisation, it is hard not to admire, whatever one thinks of the man. Then in 1671, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama with roughly 1,400 men to attack Panama City on the Pacific side, the gathering point for Peruvian silver. The march took 9 days through forest and swamp, with almost no food, because the Spanish had cleared everything ahead of them. Exquemelin describes men boiling leather bags to eat them. When they came out onto the plain before the city, they were starving and exhausted, and they still won the battle, largely because the defending force was hastily assembled and because a scheme to stampede cattle through the buccaneer line went about as well as such schemes usually do. The city burned. Whether Morgan ordered it or the retreating Spanish fired it themselves to deny him the plunder is disputed in the sources and has never been settled. The old city was never rebuilt on that spot. Its ruins, Panama Viejo, are still there, a cathedral tower standing in cut grass with the modern skyline behind it. And the plunder, when divided, was disappointing. Much of the city's wealth had been carried off by ship before Morgan arrived. There were bitter accusations that he had cheated his men. He probably had not, at least not by the standards of the time, but the suspicion attached to him. Here is the part that matters most, though. England and Spain had signed a peace treaty in Madrid the previous year. Morgan's attack was, in strict legal terms, an act of war during peacetime. He was arrested and shipped to London, and rather than being punished, he was received, questioned, entertained, and eventually knighted and sent back to Jamaica as lieutenant governor. Sir Henry Morgan then spent the last decade of his life as a senior colonial official, a plantation owner, and a judge, and in that capacity, he presided over the suppression of piracy, sending former colleagues to the gallows. He died in 1688, wealthy and gouty, and was buried at Port Royal with a gun salute. 4 years later, on the 7th of June 1692, at about 20 minutes to midday, an earthquake struck. Port Royal was built on sand. The shaking turned that sand to liquid, and 2/3 of the town slid into the harbor. Wharves, warehouses, streets of brick houses, the cemetery in which Morgan lay, all of it went down into the water in a matter of minutes, followed by a wave that came over what was left. Something like 2,000 people died in the event, and perhaps as many again in the disease that followed. Survivors described watching the ground open and close. Kingston was founded across the harbor to house the refugees and became the capital. Port Royal never recovered. Today it is a quiet village with a fort and a few old buildings, and beneath the water offshore lies one of the most remarkable underwater archaeological sites in the world, a 17th century town preserved almost as it was, with buildings standing upright under the silt, and everyday objects still on the shelves where they were left. Divers have brought up pewter plates with meals still identifiable, a pocket watch stopped at the hour, wine bottles, shoes, a brass compass. There is something quietly appropriate about it. A town that lived on stolen silver, resting under warm, shallow water, with the fish going in and out of its windows. But the sinking of Port Royal is not why the buccaneer era ended. That had already happened, for reasons of policy rather than geology. The European powers were building real colonies now, with sugar plantations that generated more reliable wealth than raiding ever had, and planters do not want a war with the neighbors. The commissions dried up, the buccaneers dispersed, some into legitimate trade, some into the Pacific, some into the logwood cutting camps of the Bay of Campeche, where they scraped a living in the mangroves. And for about 20 years, the Caribbean was comparatively quiet. Then Europe went to war over who should be king of Spain, and when that war ended, everything changed at once. The War of the Spanish Succession began in 1701, and lasted, in one form or another, until 1714. Its cause was dynastic. The Spanish King Charles II died without an heir, having been the last of a line so inbred that his medical history reads as a warning, and the thrones of Spain and its empire were left to a grandson of Louis XIV of France. The prospect of France and Spain, united under one family, alarmed everyone else in Europe, and a grand alliance formed to prevent it. For our purposes, what matters is not the diplomacy, it is the numbers. To fight that war, the Royal Navy expanded enormously. At its wartime peak, it employed something in the region of 40 to 50,000 seamen. Privateering expanded alongside it, with hundreds of private vessels commissioned to prey on French and Spanish trade, employing thousands more. For over a decade there was work at sea for any man who wanted it, and beyond that, for a great many men who did not, because the press gangs took them anyway. Then, in 1713 and 1714, the treaties were signed, peace arrived, and the Navy discharged its men. Within roughly 2 years, the fleet's manpower fell by something like 3/4. Tens of thousands of trained seamen were put ashore, most of them in port towns. Many of them owed back pay that arrived late or never. At the same time, every privateer commission became void, throwing thousands more onto the same market. Merchant shipping could not absorb them. In fact, the opposite happened, because with the war over and the risk of capture reduced, merchant owners cut crew sizes and cut wages, and a berth that had paid 50 shillings a month in wartime paid perhaps 25 in peace. So you had a very large number of men with one highly specialized skill, no work, no savings, and no prospect of any. Many of them were in the Caribbean already, or in the North American colonies, or on the West African coast. They knew ships, guns, navigation, and weather. They knew where the trade routes ran and when. That is the engine of the Golden Age. Not romance, not adventure, unemployment. There was one further ingredient, and it arrived in the summer of 1715, in the most spectacular way imaginable. A Spanish treasure fleet of 11 ships left Havana on the 24th of July, carrying an enormous accumulated cargo, several years of silver and gold that had built up during the war when sailing had been too dangerous. They sailed late in the season, which was a gamble, and they lost it. On the 30th of July, a hurricane caught them off the east coast of Florida and drove them onto the reefs and shoals between what is now Cape Canaveral and Fort Pierce. 10 of the 11 ships were lost. Perhaps 1,000 people drowned. The Spanish immediately set up a salvage camp ashore and began recovering what they could, using divers, many of them enslaved men from the pearl fisheries, working in the surf over broken hulls. Word of the wrecks and the salvage camp spread through the Caribbean within weeks, and every unemployed sailor in the region understood the situation perfectly. There was a beach in Florida with treasure piled on it, guarded by a small garrison, hundreds of miles from any Spanish stronghold. A former privateer named Henry Jennings sailed from Jamaica with 3 ships and around 300 men, landed, overwhelmed the guard, and took away a sum usually given as around 350,000 pieces of 8. Others followed. The wrecks were picked over by anyone with a boat for the next 2 years. That raid did 2 things. It made a large number of men suddenly rich enough to fit out their own vessels, and it made a large number of others certain that this was a viable way to live. The capital and the confidence for the Golden Age both came out of that hurricane, and the men who took part in it needed somewhere to go afterwards, because Jamaica's governor, whatever he privately thought, could not be seen to harbor them. They went to the Bahamas. But before we walk into Nassau, we should spend some proper time on the thing that actually explains why sailors made this choice. Because the standard question, why would a man become a pirate, is the wrong way round. The better question is what he was leaving. Consider a merchant seaman in about 1716. He signs on to a vessel of perhaps 150 tons, carrying sugar and rum from Barbados to Bristol. There will be maybe 12 of them to work her. His wage is fixed and low, and he will not see most of it until the voyage ends, which is the owner's insurance against desertion. His food is salt beef or salt pork out of a cask, ship's biscuit, dried peas, and beer or water that goes foul within weeks. Fresh food lasts as long as the first fortnight. Scurvy is understood only vaguely, and though citrus is known by some captains to help, its use is inconsistent and will not become standard in the Royal Navy for another half-century. He sleeps in the forecastle, in the bow, which is the noisiest and wettest part of the ship, and the part that moves most violently in a seaway. In warm latitudes it is airless. In cold ones, it is streaming with condensation. He has a hammock, or a bit of bedding on a chest, and he sleeps in 4-hour blocks, because the watch system does not stop for anyone. His work is physically brutal in a way that is difficult to convey. Hauling wet rope, which is far heavier than dry. Working aloft in the dark on a foot rope, with the ship rolling 20 degrees each way, and nothing between him and the deck. Pumping, always pumping, because every wooden ship leaks, and some leak a great deal. Serious injuries were routine. Crushed hands, broken legs, hernias, falls. And over him stands a master whose authority is close to absolute. He can order a flogging. He can stop a man's wages for insolence. There were good captains and there were bad ones, and a man who signed with a bad one had almost no remedy, because the law in this period was overwhelmingly written to protect the owner's property and the master's authority, and a sailor bringing a complaint in a colonial court was likely to be treated as a mutineer. The Royal Navy was in some ways better and in some ways very much worse. The food was more reliable, the surgeon was real, and there was a pension fund at Greenwich for the disabled, at least in principle. But the discipline was harsher, the voyages were longer, the ship was far more crowded, and, decisively, a man could be taken into it against his will. The press gang could and did seize men off merchant ships coming into harbor, out of taverns, off the street. Men served for years without leave, unable to see their families, unable to leave, with pay chronically in arrears. Now set against that a pirate vessel. The captain is elected and can be voted out. Plunder is divided by an agreed formula in which the ordinary hand gets 1 share and the captain perhaps 1.5 or 2, a ratio that would have astonished anyone who knew what a merchant owner took. Decisions about where to sail and whom to attack are put to the whole company. There is written compensation for losing a limb. There is no press gang. The work is intermittent, and the food, when there is any, is eaten without rationing. The odds of dying are high. The odds of hanging are considerable. Most careers lasted well under 2 years. But a man of 25 who had already been at sea for a decade, whose body was starting to fail, who had watched a friend fall from a yard into black water, who had been beaten by a mate for slow work, who had no property and no prospect of any, might look at those odds and conclude that a short life on his own terms was preferable to a long one on someone else's. They said so themselves often. One of the most quoted lines in the whole subject comes from a pirate named Bartholomew Roberts, who is supposed to have said that in an honest service there were thin rations, low wages, and hard labor, while in this a man had plenty and ease, and the worst of it was only a sour look or two at the choking. A merry life and a short one, he is reported to have concluded, would be his motto. It comes to us through a book we will discuss shortly, and it may well have been polished by the writer. But the sentiment appears again and again in trial records, in captured letters, in the testimony of men who had no reason to be poetic. They knew exactly what they were choosing. The Bahamas are not one island, but around 700 of them, with several thousand cays and rocks besides, spread across a shallow bank north of Cuba. The water there is the shallowest and clearest in the whole region, so pale over the sand flats that, from a height, it looks like a sheet of milk glass, and so shoal in places that a ship of any size must know exactly where she is going, or she will be aground before her people have finished arguing about it. That shallowness was the entire point. New Providence sits near the middle of the group. Its harbor is formed by a long, thin island lying parallel to the shore, Hog Island, later renamed Paradise Island by people with a hotel to sell. Between the two runs a sheltered channel with entrances at either end. The eastern entrance is deep enough for a small warship. The western is shallower, and the harbor itself, comfortable for sloops drawing 8 or 9 feet, is awkward for a fourth-rate man of war drawing 17. So a pirate sloop could lie there in safety, knowing that anything big enough to destroy her could not easily get in, and that if it tried the other end of the channel offered a way out. It was, geographically speaking, close to ideal. There had been an English settlement there since the 1670s. It had been sacked by the Spanish and the French repeatedly, most destructively in 1703, and by 1715 the town of Nassau was a half-ruin. The fort was derelict. The proprietors who nominally owned the colony had lost interest. There was no functioning governor. There was no garrison, no court, no customs house, no gaol. Into that vacuum came the men from the Florida wrecks, and then everyone else. Within 2 years there were perhaps 1,000 of them, and at times reportedly closer to 2,000, which made Nassau one of the larger English-speaking settlements in the Americas. They did not build a city. They built a camp that never quite stopped being temporary. Walk through it, in your mind, on an ordinary afternoon in 1717. The harbor is full of small craft, sloops mostly, single-masted, low and fast and shallow, the workhorse of these waters. Some lie at anchor. 2 or 3 are careened on the beach at the eastern end, tipped right over with their masts angled towards the sand. Men working along the exposed bottom with scrapers and torches, the smell of hot pitch carrying a long way. A pirate's life depended on speed, and speed depended on a clean hull, and in warm water weed and shipworm grow with an enthusiasm that has to be seen to be believed. A hull left 6 months becomes a floating garden. Above the tide line the tents begin. Old sails stretched over spars and lashed to palms. Some of them elaborate, some barely more than a windbreak. There are a few actual buildings of stone and timber, survivors of the settlement, patched and reoccupied. There are cook fires with turtle and pork and whatever the fishing has produced. There are goats. There are enormous numbers of flies, because the whole beach is used as a rubbish tip, and the smell of the place, by every contemporary account, was appalling. One naval officer who visited described it in terms that would not pass without editing. There are traders. This is the part that gets left out of the films. Nassau existed because it had customers. Merchants came from New York, from Charleston, from Bermuda, from the Dutch and Danish islands, and they bought stolen cargo at a discount and sold provisions, powder, shot, rope, canvas, and rum at a premium. Some of these were respectable men with respectable warehouses at home. The colonial economy of the entire eastern seaboard had a quiet interest in the black market, and governors wrote furious letters about the fact to London, while their own merchants carried on. There are women, some of them running the drinking tents, some of them trading, some of them enslaved and with no choice about being there at all. That last point deserves to be stated plainly, because a great deal of writing about Nassau describes it as a place of freedom, and forgets that a meaningful proportion of the people on that beach were not free. And there are the pirates themselves, several hundred of them at any given moment, sitting under awnings in the heat, playing cards and dice, mending clothes, arguing, sleeping off the previous night, waiting for the next voyage to be proposed. At night it becomes almost beautiful. The fires come up along the strand, and the light of them runs out across the black water in long broken columns. Lanterns swing at the sterns of the anchored sloops, rising and falling very slightly as the swell comes through the harbor mouth. Somebody is playing a fiddle badly, and somebody else is singing along worse. The palms on Hog Island are black shapes against a sky that has gone a deep, transparent indigo, and the stars come out in their thousands, the way they only do where there is no other light for 200 miles. The wind drops at dusk and comes back gently off the land, warm, smelling of vegetation and wood smoke. The water laps at the hulls. Somewhere out beyond the point, the reef keeps up its low, steady murmur, the same sound it has made all day and will make all night. If you are drifting a little by now, that is exactly right. Stay with the sound of that water. It has nowhere to be. Nassau has been called the Republic of Pirates, and it is a good phrase, popularized by the historian Colin Woodard, though we should be careful with the word republic. There was no constitution, no assembly, no elections for any office ashore, no laws, no courts. Nobody drafted anything. What existed was an absence of government that a large number of armed men found convenient, plus a set of shared customs about how ships were run. Those shipboard customs, however, were remarkable, and they are the reason this period continues to interest historians who care nothing for treasure. A pirate company was a self-governing association. When men decided to go on account, which was the phrase they used, they gathered, agreed a set of written articles, and signed or made their mark on them. Several sets survive, mostly because they were captured and produced as evidence at trials, which is a somewhat ironic reason for their preservation. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts's company are the best known. They provided that every man had a vote in affairs of the moment and equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquors as they were taken. They provided that every man should be called fairly in turn by the list on board of prizes, and that anyone found defrauding the company of even a trifle in plate, jewels, or money should be marooned. They regulated gaming, banning cards and dice for money aboard, because gambling debts between armed men in a confined space had obvious consequences. They set a curfew on lights and candles at 8 in the evening, and required that anyone wishing to drink after that hour do so on the open deck. They required every man to keep his weapons clean and fit for service, and there was an inspection. They provided that no boy or woman was to be brought aboard, and that any man found seducing a woman and carrying her to sea in disguise should suffer death. This has been read in various ways. It was almost certainly a practical measure to prevent the violent jealousies that would follow, rather than any statement of principle, and it sits very awkwardly beside the well-documented sexual violence that pirates inflicted on captured women, which the articles did not address at all. They provided that no man might leave the company until each had shared £1,000. They provided that disputes between crew members must be settled ashore, not aboard, with sword and pistol, under the supervision of the quartermaster, which took a knife fight below decks and turned it into a formal duel on a beach. And they provided compensation for injury, the loss of a limb, or becoming a cripple in their service, entitled a man to 800 pieces of 8 from the common stock, with lesser sums proportionally for lesser injuries. Other companies had more detailed tariffs. A right arm was worth more than a left, on the assumption that most men were right-handed, and the loss more disabling. An eye or a finger was worth less, and consider what that is. It is workmen's compensation insurance, funded collectively, agreed in advance, and paid out before the general division of plunder. It appears among illiterate and semi-literate men on illegal ships in the 1710s. The Royal Navy's provision for disabled seamen was chronically underfunded and administratively hostile. A merchant sailor who lost a hand generally lost his livelihood with it and became a beggar. The captain, in most companies, was elected by majority vote and could be deposed the same way. His absolute authority applied only in chase and in battle. At all other times he was, in the words of one contemporary account, governed by the majority. He often had no better cabin than anyone else, and men would walk in and take food off his plate to make the point. The real day-to-day power lay with the quartermaster, also elected, who represented the crew against the captain, divided the plunder, decided which cargo to keep, adjudicated disputes, and administered punishment. It is an arrangement that looks a great deal like a trade union steward sitting alongside a wartime commander, and no other institution in the Atlantic world of that period looked anything like it. We should not romanticize this, and the best historians of the subject do not. Marcus Rediker has argued forcefully that pirate ships represented a genuine, if brutal, experiment in a different social order, an inversion of the merchant ship's hierarchy by men who knew exactly what they were inverting. Others, including Arne Bielaszewski and Peter Earle, have pointed out that the democracy was for members only, that it did not extend to captives or to the enslaved people pirates frequently sold, that violence within these companies was constant, and that the articles were often ignored when a strong captain felt like ignoring them. The truth is probably that both readings are describing the same thing from different angles. It was a democracy of thieves. That it was a democracy at all is historically astonishing. That it was a democracy of thieves is not something that should be forgotten. Let us go aboard properly then, and spend some time simply living on one of these ships, because the daily texture of it is more interesting than the battles, and it is very much easier to fall asleep to. The first thing to understand is that a ship is a machine made almost entirely of things that rot: oak and elm and pine, hemp rope, flax canvas, tallow, tar, leather. Everything on her is under constant attack from salt, sun, damp and organisms, and the work of keeping her alive never stops. That is what sailors did with the vast majority of their time. Not fighting, maintenance. A typical day began before dawn because the watch system ran continuously. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, with the evening dog watches split into 2 hours each so that the same men did not stand the same watch every night. It meant that nobody in the age of sail ever slept more than about 4 hours at a stretch for months on end. The effects of that on the human body and mind are considerable, and it is worth bearing in mind when you read about the quick tempers and the strange decisions. The morning watch would wash down the decks, seawater hauled up in buckets, sand scattered, and then the holystones, blocks of sandstone rubbed back and forth across the planking on hands and knees, until the wood came up pale. Then the ropes were checked, the running rigging renewed where it had chafed, the standing rigging tarred, the sails inspected for weak seams. A sailmaker sat cross-legged in the shade, with a palm strapped to his hand, pushing a needle through canvas. The carpenter went round the hull with a mallet, listening. Somebody was always at the pump. Food was cooked in a brick hearth or an iron firebox, usually well forward. On a pirate ship, the cook was frequently a man who had been disabled and could no longer do heavy work, which was an act of practical kindness, dressed up as a job assignment. The main provision was salt beef or salt pork out of the cask, preserved in brine so strong that it had to be steeped in fresh water before it was edible, and even then, it came out grey and stringy. Ship's biscuit was flour and water baked twice until it was almost rock, and it kept for years, and it was invariably infested with weevils. Sailors ate it in the dark, or tapped it on the table first to make the inhabitants leave. Dried peas made a thick soup. There might be cheese, which sweated and went rancid, and butter that did the same. Pirates, though, ate rather better than most seamen, for one simple reason. They took what they liked from every ship they captured, and they were not rationing for a fixed voyage. So they had fresh meat when they took a ship carrying livestock, and sugar and fruit and spices and wine and chocolate when they took a ship carrying those. They caught turtles, which could be kept alive on their backs on deck for weeks, and provided fresh meat on demand. And green turtle was regarded as a delicacy across the whole Caribbean. They fished. They went ashore for water and coconuts, and whatever fruit grew near the landing. A favored dish was salmagundi, a great communal bowl of whatever was available. Chopped meat of several kinds, fish, pickled vegetables, boiled eggs, onions, olives, dressed heavily with oil, vinegar, salt, mustard, and pepper. It sounds chaotic, and it probably was. It also sounds, on a hot afternoon at anchor, rather good. And there was drink, constantly. Water went bad in the cask within a few weeks, going green and then black and then, oddly, sometimes clear again, once the biology had finished with it. So people drank beer, wine, brandy, and above all rum, which the Caribbean produced in enormous quantity as a byproduct of sugar. Rum mixed with water and sugar and a little lime or nutmeg was punch, and punch was the social fuel of the entire region. Drunkenness aboard pirate ships was routine, and it killed people. Captured crews sometimes escaped or retook their ships because the pirates guarding them were insensible. On at least one famous occasion, an entire company was taken by the Royal Navy while too drunk to fight. Sleep, since we are on the subject. Merchant and naval seamen slept in the forecastle or on the gun deck in hammocks slung from the beams, packed close, 14 inches of width allocated per man in the Navy, which meant they touched. A hammock is actually an excellent piece of engineering. It swings with the ship, so the sleeper stays roughly level while everything around him rolls. Sailors adopted it from the Caribbean, from the Taino word hamaca, one of a number of words this sea gave to the English language, along with canoe, hurricane, barbecue, and cannibal. On a pirate ship, arrangements were looser. Crews were often 2 or 3 times the size a vessel was designed for, because numbers mattered when boarding, so men slept wherever there was space. On deck under the stars in fair weather, which in the Caribbean is most of the time, and which is the more pleasant option by a wide margin. Below, in the hold, on top of the cargo. In the boats. A ship at anchor on a warm night with 60 men asleep on her deck must have been a strange sight. Bodies everywhere, a few figures moving carefully between them on watch. Think about that for a moment. Lying on scrubbed planking still warm from the day, with a rolled-up coat under your head, the mast swaying very slowly across the stars above you as the ship works at her cable, the rigging making its small sounds, a block knocking somewhere, a halyard tapping, water moving along the hull with a sound like a held breath. Someone talking quietly at the wheel, and overhead the whole southern sky turning imperceptibly, the way it has turned every night since before any of this began. That was ordinary. For thousands of men, night after night, that was simply what going to sleep was. Hygiene was, by modern standards, non-existent, though we should be careful not to overstate it. Sailors bathed in seawater and washed clothes in it too, which does not remove salt, and so leaves fabric permanently damp and abrasive. In the tropics, men often worked and slept in very little. Lice were universal. Rats were everywhere on every ship, and so were cockroaches in numbers that visitors from cooler climates found genuinely shocking. The bilge, the lowest part of the hull where water collected, was the source of a smell that permeated everything and that experienced sailors stopped noticing. Illness killed far more seafarers than combat ever did. Malaria and yellow fever were endemic in the Caribbean, and yellow fever in particular could take a healthy man in under a week. Dysentery moved through crowded ships with awful speed. Scurvy appeared on long passages. Venereal disease was rife, and its treatment, mercury, was often worse than the condition. Medical care aboard a pirate ship was whatever they could get. A trained surgeon was so valuable that pirates routinely forced them to join from captured vessels, and there are several documented cases of surgeons being seized specifically, and then, at their trials, defending themselves by proving they had been taken against their will. Blackbeard, when he blockaded Charleston, is recorded as having demanded a chest of medicines as his principal ransom, which tells you a good deal about the state of his crew. Surgery meant amputation, and amputation meant speed, because there was no anesthetic beyond rum and a leather strap. A good surgeon could take a leg off below the knee in under a minute. The patient was held down by his shipmates. Cauterization with hot tar or a heated iron controlled the bleeding. Infection then decided the outcome, and roughly half the time it decided against, which is exactly why those compensation clauses in the articles existed, and on why the men signed them so readily. They all knew someone it had happened to. For entertainment there was music, and there was a great deal of it. Musicians were another category regularly pressed from captured ships. Roberts's articles specified that the musicians should have rest on the Sabbath day, but on the other 6 days and nights, they were to play if the company required it, which is a sentence that contains an entire world of exhausted fiddlers. Fiddles, drums, trumpets, and the human voice. Sea shanties as we know them are largely a 19th century development, but work songs existed, and songs from home, and the noise of a ship's company singing badly at anchor carried a long way over water. They gambled, despite the articles, and they danced, and they told stories, and they slept in the afternoon heat. They argued about religion, some of them with startling seriousness. They read, a few of them, and books turn up regularly in the inventories of captured pirate ships. They fished off the side and watched the sea, because there is nothing else to look at and a great deal happening in it. The wildlife alone would have filled the hours. Flying fish coming out of the bow wave in silver showers, sometimes landing on deck. Dolphins riding the pressure wave at the stem for miles, effortlessly, rolling to look up. Frigate birds hanging so high they were specks. Boobies diving. Green turtles surfacing to breathe with a sound like a sigh. Phosphorescence in the wake at night, so bright in some conditions that the ship seemed to be pushing through cold fire. Every stroke of a passing fish, leaving a glowing trail in the black water. Sailors of this period believed all sorts of things about the sea, and were laughed at for it by people who had never been on it. Rather, a lot of what they described has turned out to be true. We have a remarkable eyewitness account of what it was actually like to be taken by pirates, and it is worth spending some time with, because it does something no summary can. It gives you the small details that nobody would think to invent. William Snelgrave was an English slave ship captain, and in April 1719, his vessel, the Bird, was lying in the Sierra Leone River on the West African coast when she was taken by a pirate crew under Thomas Coughlin, later joined by Howell Davis and Olivier Labouze. Snelgrave was held for about a month. He survived, went home, and years later published a book about the African trade with a long chapter describing the whole experience. He is not a sympathetic narrator. He was a professional slaver, and his account of the trade is written with a complacency that is difficult to read now. But he was there, he was observant, and he had no motive to make pirates look good. The capture itself began in the dark, with a boat coming alongside and a voice hailing. Snelgrave's own crew refused to fire, which he notes with bitterness. He was taken aboard and immediately struck with the flat of a sword and threatened with a pistol. And then the situation changed entirely when it emerged that his own men would not accuse him of ill treatment. The pirate quartermaster asked the Bird's sailors directly whether their captain had been cruel to them. They said he had not. That answer probably saved his life. This detail appears again and again in the record, and it is one of the most revealing things about Golden Age piracy. Pirates routinely interrogated captured crews about their officers and treated the officers accordingly. A master known for flogging or for withholding food could expect to be beaten, whipped, or killed. A master whose men spoke for him was usually released with his personal belongings. It was rough, arbitrary, and inconsistent, but it was recognizably a form of judgment, and it terrified merchant captains up and down the Atlantic in a way that no legal system had ever managed. What Snelgrave describes afterwards is chaos rather than menace. The pirates broke open his cargo and helped themselves. They took his fine clothes and wore them badly. They found bottles of wine. and, being unwilling to look for a corkscrew, knocked the necks off with a cutlass and drank from the broken glass. They emptied a cask of good claret into a tub in the middle of the deck and dipped it out with mugs and buckets, spilling most of it. They burned his ship's papers because papers were associated with authority. They wasted, by his account, 10 times what they took. He describes them wearing captured finery over filthy shirts, hats with feathers, embroidered waistcoats, silk stockings, and no shoes. He describes the noise, the constant arguing, the drinking that started in the morning. He describes being given a new suit of clothes by the pirate captain out of his own captured stock, in a gesture of what seems to have been genuine, if bizarre, hospitality. And he describes a moment when one of the pirates, drunk, tried to shoot him, and another pirate knocked the pistol aside and told him plainly that these people would not hurt a man who had used his crew well. That is the world, violent, drunk, wasteful, and operating by a code that was real even when it was being broken. Clothing, since Snellgrave brings it up, is worth a paragraph on its own, because the popular image is not entirely wrong for once. An ordinary seaman of this period wore what were called slops, cheap ready-made garments sold from the ship's stores, loose wide-legged trousers ending above the ankle, practical for going aloft, and easy to roll up. A short jacket, because a long coat catches on rigging and kills people. A checked or striped shirt. A neckerchief, which was genuinely useful for keeping sun off the back of the neck and sweat out of the eyes, and which in the Caribbean sun was not optional. A knitted cap or a low-crowned hat. Tarred canvas for wet weather. Bare feet on deck a great deal of the time, since bare feet grip wet planking better than shoes do. The pirate's departure from this was the plunder. A man who took a merchant's sea chest wore what was in it, and if that meant a velvet coat over a tarred shirt, then that is what he wore. Trial records mention captured pirates in silk. Roberts in his Crimson Damask is the extreme version, but the tendency was general, and it was partly practical intimidation, and partly, I suspect, straightforward pleasure. These were men who had spent their lives in the cheapest cloth available. The chance to walk about a deck in a gentleman's waistcoat would have been enormously satisfying. Earrings appear in some accounts, and the folklore that they were gold so that a drowned man's finder could pay for his burial is charming and unsupported. Sailors wore jewelry for the reasons anyone does. Tattoos, incidentally, are largely a later development in the European maritime world, arriving in force after Pacific voyages later in the century. A Golden Age pirate covered in tattoos is an anachronism, though sailors certainly marked themselves in simpler ways. Now, there is one more everyday matter to set beside all this, and it is the one that best explains why these companies stayed together at all. Consider a man called, let us say, John from Wapping, age 26, who has been at sea since he was 11. He cannot read. He has no family living. He has been in the Navy against his will for 4 years and in the merchant service for 6. He has broken his collarbone twice and lost the top joint of 2 fingers. He has never in his life been consulted about anything. He is taken by pirates in 1718, and they ask him whether he wants to join, and if he says yes, then within a week he is being asked to vote. Not about anything grand, about whether to careen at this quay or the next one, about whether to keep a captured sail or trade it, about whether the man who stole from the common chest should be put ashore or flogged. Small questions, and his voice counts exactly as much as anyone else's. Nobody had ever asked him anything before. That is not a small thing. It may be the single most powerful force holding these companies together, more than the money, more than the rum, more than the fear of the alternative. For a few months, in the middle of the 18th century, a man of no property and no education and no prospects was a full member of a body that made its own decisions. They wrote it down too, which is the part I find most moving. Men who could barely form letters insisted on written articles, and signed them, or made their marks on them, and kept them, and referred back to them in arguments. They had seen what happened when authority was not written down, and could therefore be whatever the man in the cabin said it was. Trial after trial produced defendants who quoted their own articles at the court. They knew the terms, they had agreed them, and then, almost without exception, the court hanged them anyway. The ships themselves deserved their own quiet hour, because a great deal of what pirates could and could not do was decided by naval architecture rather than by courage. The vessel most associated with Caribbean piracy is the sloop, and it was chosen for excellent reasons. A Bermuda-built sloop of this period was perhaps 40 to 60 feet on deck, single-masted, with a very large fore and aft mainsail, a long bowsprit, and a raked mast. Bermudian shipwrights, working in the island's own cedar, which is light, strong, and remarkably resistant to rot, produced hulls of a fineness that other yards could not match. These boats were fast. They pointed close to the wind, which square-rigged ships could not, meaning a sloop could sail up towards a wind that a merchantman had to run away from. They drew little water, so they could go into shallow bays and over banks, where a pursuing warship dared not follow, and they were cheap. For a pirate, that combination is everything: speed to catch, weatherliness to escape upwind, shallow draft to escape into the shoals. A sloop of that size might carry 8 or 12 small guns and 70 or 80 men, which was ludicrously overcrewed for handling her and exactly right for taking someone else's ship. Above the sloop came the brigantine and the schooner, two-masted, more sail area, more range, more cargo capacity, still handy. A brigantine of 100 tons with 14 guns was a serious proposition, and could keep the sea for months. Above those came the full-rigged ships, three-masted and square-rigged, which included everything from armed merchantmen to naval frigates. These were the ocean crossers. They carried more sail in more combinations, could be balanced to steer themselves for hours, and could mount real batteries. When a pirate captured one and converted her, as Blackbeard did with the Queen Anne's Revenge, and Roberts did more than once, he acquired the ability to fight a warship rather than merely flee one. He also acquired a vessel that needed a large crew, drew a great deal of water, could not enter the shallow refuges, and was expensive to maintain. Several careers were transformed by getting such a ship, and several were ended by having one. The galleon, which appears in every pirate film, was really a 16th and early 17th century type, a tall, heavily built ship developed for the Spanish treasure routes, with a high stern castle and a rounded hull built to carry weight rather than to sail fast. By the Golden Age proper, the true galleon was obsolescent, replaced by more modern designs. If you have a mental image of pirates chasing a galleon, you are picturing the buccaneer era of Morgan and Drake, rather than the era of Blackbeard. And the ordinary merchant ship, the actual prey, was usually something unglamorous. A slow, tubby, undermanned vessel of 100 to 300 tons, carrying sugar, rum, tobacco, cloth, timber, or enslaved people, with perhaps a dozen crew and 6 guns that nobody had exercised in a year. That is what most piracy consisted of, not dueling frigates, frightening a dozen tired men into surrender. Now navigation, which is the part that genuinely deserves admiration. Latitude, your position north or south, was solvable. At noon, a navigator measured the angle of the sun above the horizon with a cross staff, a backstaff, or, increasingly in this period, an octant, and combined it with tables of the sun's declination for that date. The arithmetic was straightforward once learned. At night, the same could be done with the pole star in northern waters. A reasonable navigator could fix his latitude to within a few miles. Longitude, your position east or west, could not be solved at all. This is difficult for modern people to absorb. Finding longitude requires knowing the time at a reference place while you observe local noon. and no clock existed that could keep accurate time aboard a moving ship in changing temperature and humidity. John Harrison's chronometers, which finally solved it, were being developed in exactly this period and did not enter general service until decades later. So every ship crossing an ocean between 1500 and 1760 was, in the east-west dimension, guessing. The guess was called dead reckoning, and it was a genuine art. You know the course you have steered, from the compass, corrected for magnetic variation, which was itself imperfectly charted. You estimate your speed by heaving the log, a triangular board on a line knotted at fixed intervals, thrown over the stern while a sandglass runs, counting the knots that pass through your fingers, which is where the word comes from. You keep a traverse board, a wooden pegboard, on which the helmsman marks course and speed each half hour, so the information is not lost. You add up the vectors. You allow for leeway, the sideways slip a ship makes when sailing on a wind. You allow for current, if you have any idea what the current is doing, which in the Caribbean you might, and in the open Atlantic you often did not. And then you commit, and you sail for weeks, and you find out whether you were right. Navigators managed remarkable things this way, and they also made errors that killed everyone aboard. The standard defensive technique was to run down the latitude. Get to the latitude of your destination well out to sea, where you know you are safe, then turn and sail along that line of latitude until you make land. It wasted time, and it worked. It is why ships approached Barbados, the most easterly island, and therefore the natural Atlantic landfall, along a particular line for centuries. Charts existed, and were of wildly varying quality. Coastlines were often good, where trade was heavy, and fictional, where it was not. Depths were sparse, reefs were frequently unmarked, because the ship that found them did not come back to report. A prudent master in Caribbean waters navigated by eye as much as by paper, sending a man aloft to read the water. This is a real skill, and it still works today. Deep water is dark blue. Shallow sand is pale green or almost white. Coral head shows brown. Grass shows dark green-brown, and can be mistaken for coral by the inexperienced. A lookout at the masthead with the sun behind him can see the bottom coming up, long before the leadsman finds it. The lead itself was the other tool, a weight on a marked line, swung forward and dropped, the depth read as the ship passes over it. The bottom of the lead was hollowed and filled with tallow, so it brought up a sample: sand, shell, mud, gravel. An experienced pilot approaching a coast in fog could tell roughly where he was, from what the tallow came up with. And old sailing directions record the bottom types along a coast for exactly that purpose. And then there were the stars, which mattered enormously even when they were not being formally measured. A helmsman steering through the night on a clear Caribbean sky did not stare at the compass. He picked a star at the right bearing and steered by it, glancing at the compass occasionally to check for drift as the star moved. It is easier, steadier, and gentler on the eyes, and every sailing person still does it. So through those long night watches, a man stood at the tiller with the whole sky in front of him, holding the ship's head on some particular point of light, hour after hour, while the ship talked to herself around him. Orion coming up out of the eastern sea in the winter months, lying almost on his side at that latitude. The Southern Cross, visible low to the south from the lower Caribbean, which northern sailors found remarkable and wrote about. Scorpius, sprawling enormous across the summer sky. The Milky Way, arching over from horizon to horizon, with a texture and depth that no photograph ever quite conveys. And all of it wheeling very slowly westward through the watch, so that the star you chose at the beginning has moved, and you must choose another. The trade winds carried you, and the current carried you, and the stars told you which way you were going, and none of it required anything but knowledge, patience, and a willingness to be wrong occasionally. There is something restful in that, I think. Those men had no instruments worth the name, and no way of calling for help and no accurate map of where they were, and they crossed and recrossed an ocean anyway, and made landfall, and did it again the following season. So how did a capture actually happen? The films have taught us to expect broadsides and grappling hooks, and a great deal of shouting. The reality was usually quieter and more psychological, and once you understand why, the whole business makes more sense. A pirate's objective was to take a ship intact. Cargo is worth nothing at the bottom of the sea. A hull holed below the waterline is a liability. Men killed in the fight are men who cannot work the prize back to port, and men wounded are men entitled to compensation out of the common stock. A pirate who fought a hard battle for every capture would have been dead or bankrupt within months. So the entire method was designed to make the merchant surrender without a shot. It began with disguise. A pirate approaching a strange sail would show no colors at all, or false ones, and there was no dishonor in this by the conventions of the time, provided you hoisted your true flag before opening fire. She would trim her sails to look slow, or trail a drogue over the stern, or set only part of her canvas, so as not to alarm the chase. Her crew would keep below, because a low sloop with 80 men visible on deck announces itself instantly. The pursuit could take hours. This is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the strangest features of naval life in the age of sail. Two ships 4 miles apart, converging by half a knot, all afternoon, with everybody on both vessels knowing exactly what is going to happen, and nobody able to hurry it. The merchant crew rigging what defenses they had, or arguing about whether to. The pirates eating, checking weapons, painting their faces or not, sharpening things. And between them, a flat sunlit sea, and a steady breeze, and hours of time, the whole thing unfolding at the pace of a slow walk. Then, at the last, the transformation. Guns run out, men appearing along the rail all at once, and the black flag going up. Pirate flags are one of the few parts of the legend that are genuinely true, though the detail is different from the popular image. There was no single Jolly Roger. There were dozens of personal designs, and the sources for them are mostly descriptions in newspapers and trial testimony, rather than surviving cloth. So a great deal of what you see reproduced today is 19th and 20th century artwork based on those descriptions. The vocabulary was consistent. A skull, sometimes called a death's head, which appeared on ordinary English gravestones of the period, and would have been instantly legible. A skeleton, often shown whole. An hourglass, meaning your time is running out. A bleeding heart. A raised cutlass or dart. Blackbeard's reported flag showed a horned skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand, and a spear pointed at a heart with 3 drops of blood. Bartholomew Roberts had one showing himself standing on 2 skulls, labeled ABH and AMH, meaning a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head. A personal grudge, advertised as policy. Some flew a red flag as well, or instead. Red meant no quarter. The French called it the Joli Rouge, and one theory, unproven and disputed, derives Jolly Roger from that phrase. Others derive it from Old Roger as a name for the devil. Nobody knows. What the flag was for is not in doubt. It was a message, and the message was a piece of straightforward game theory. Surrender now, and you will not be harmed. Resist, and we will kill you. Pirates went to some lengths to make both halves of that promise credible, because the whole system collapsed if merchants stopped believing either one. Crews who gave up quickly were usually robbed, questioned about other shipping, sometimes recruited and released. Crews who fought, and particularly captains who had a reputation for cruelty to their own men, were sometimes treated with a savagery that was quite deliberately publicized. It worked. The overwhelming majority of captures involved no combat at all. Merchant crews, underpaid and outnumbered, had little reason to die for a cargo belonging to a man in London they had never met. When there was fighting, the tactics were governed by the wind. The weather gauge means being upwind of your opponent. It is the single most important tactical concept in sailing warfare. The ship to windward controls the engagement. She can bear down and close whenever she chooses, and her opponent cannot easily escape upwind. She can decide the range. Her smoke blows away from her towards the enemy. Against that, she heels away from her opponent under the press of wind, which raises her lee gun ports and can make it hard to fire low, and if damaged, she is being pushed towards a hostile ship rather than away. The ship to leeward has the escape option and a steadier gun platform, and if her aim is simply to get away, being downwind of a pursuer is not the disaster it sounds. Guns of the period were smoothbore muzzle loaders on wooden carriages, throwing solid iron shot. A 6-pounder threw a ball the size of a large orange. Effective range was a few hundred yards, and accuracy from a moving deck was poor, so the real practice was to close and fire fast. A trained naval crew could manage a round every 90 seconds or so. Pirates rarely had that training, and rarely needed it. Their preferred loads were anti-personnel. Grape shot, a cluster of small balls that spread like an enormous shotgun. Langrage, which was scrap iron, nails, bolts and broken glass bagged up and rammed down, murderous at close range and extremely damaging to rigging. Chain and bar shot to bring down spars. The goal was never to sink the target. It was to clear her deck and cripple her ability to sail, and then take her. Boarding was the decisive act, and it was as unpleasant as it sounds. Grapples thrown to bind the ships together. Small arms fire from the tops. Hand grenades, which existed, hollow iron or glass spheres filled with powder and a slow match, thrown down onto a crowded deck. Blackbeard's men reportedly used bottles filled with powder and shot with a fuse in the neck. The weapons in hand were the cutlass, short, heavy and single-edged, ideal in a confined space, where a long blade would foul on rigging, and the pistol, of which men carried several, because a flintlock gives you one shot and then becomes a club. Boarding axes served for cutting rigging and for fighting. Muskets were for the approach, not the melee. None of this is glamorous. Fighting on a deck slick with water and blood, in smoke, surrounded by rigging that trips you, against men who are as frightened as you are. The accounts that survive from the few real pirate battles are confused and full of noise, which is precisely why almost nobody did it. The theater existed to avoid the fight. The costume, the flag, the noise, the reputation, the stories deliberately spread in port. All of it was an elaborate advertising campaign whose purpose was to allow 80 desperate men in a small boat to take a large ship without anyone being hurt. Nobody understood that better than a man from Bristol who dressed himself, quite consciously, as a devil. Before Blackbeard there was Benjamin Hornigold, and Hornigold is worth a moment because he is the hinge between the old world and the new one. Hornigold was among the first to set up at Nassau after 1715, and he began not as a pirate exactly, but as a self-appointed privateer without a commission, attacking Spanish and French shipping while pointedly refusing to touch English vessels. He seems to have genuinely believed that made him something other than a criminal, a patriot operating in a legal grey area, which was the buccaneer tradition he had grown up hearing about. He was successful, he was respected, and he effectively ran Nassau in its early years. His crew eventually voted him out precisely because of that scruple. They wanted to take English ships too, since English ships were the ones sailing past. He was deposed, given a sloop and left. The man who had served as his lieutenant took over the larger vessel. That man was Edward Teach. We know less about Edward Teach than about almost any figure of comparable fame. Nearly everything comes from a single book, published in London in 1724, called A general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates, attributed to a Captain Charles Johnson, about whom nothing else is known. For most of the 20th century, this book was confidently attributed to Daniel Defoe, on stylistic grounds, and you will still find that attribution in older editions. Recent scholarship, particularly the work of Furbank and Owens, has largely dismantled the case, and the honest position now is that we do not know who wrote it. It may have been a journalist with good waterfront contacts. It may have been a publisher assembling material from newspapers and trial reports. Parts of it are demonstrably accurate and confirmed by independent documents. Parts of it are demonstrably invented. So when we describe Blackbeard, we are describing a portrait painted by an anonymous author with an eye for a saleable story, corrected here and there by court records and colonial correspondence. Bear that in mind through everything that follows. It is not a reason to disbelieve it all. It is a reason to hold it lightly. He was probably from Bristol, and his name was probably Teach, though it is spelled Thatch, Thacke, Take and Drummond in various documents. He was probably born around 1680. He served in the War of the Spanish Succession as a privateer out of Jamaica, and he emerged from it, like so many, unemployed and skilled. He was a big man, and he was, by all accounts, intelligent, articulate, and a competent seaman. He could read and write, which not all of his contemporaries could, and he corresponded with colonial officials in terms they took seriously. He had a talent that had nothing to do with violence, which was showmanship. The beard is the famous part, and the description in the general history is one of the great pieces of 18th century image-making. It covered his whole face, black as a raven, extraordinarily long, and he twisted it into small tails with ribbons and tucked them behind his ears. He wore a sling over his shoulders with 3 brace of pistols hanging in holsters. And in battle, or when he wished to be seen, he stuck lighted matches under his hat, slow burning cords soaked in saltpeter, so that his face appeared through a curling haze of smoke, with his eyes fierce and wild. Did he really do that? The smoking beard appears in no source before the general history, and no eyewitness account confirms it. Slow match was certainly carried aboard every armed vessel, since it was how guns were fired, so the raw material was to hand, and the practical objection that a man festooned with burning cord while carrying loose powder is a hazard to himself is real but not fatal, since gunners handled both daily. The historian's answer is that we cannot verify it. My own view, offered as a view and not a fact, is that it hardly matters, because the point of the story is that it was believed. Whether or not Teach lit those fuses, merchant captains from Virginia to Honduras thought he did, and surrendered accordingly. He was building a brand, and it worked exactly as intended. Here is the fact that should really define him. In a career of roughly 2 years, in which he took dozens of vessels, there is no reliable record of Edward Teach murdering anyone before the final battle in which he himself was killed. The most feared pirate in the Atlantic seems not to have needed to kill. In late 1717, he took a large French slave ship called La Concorde near Martinique. She was a substantial vessel of around 300 tons, and he converted her, mounted around 40 guns, and renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a name with a political flavor, since Anne had died in 1714, and the Stuart cause still had sympathizers. With her he had a warship, and for a while he behaved like an admiral, sailing with a small squadron of consorts. We should not pass over what La Concorde was. She was a slaver, taken on a voyage from West Africa, with several hundred enslaved people aboard. What became of them is partly documented and thoroughly grim. Some were kept by the pirates to work the ship, some were sold, some went with the French crew who were given a smaller vessel and left. Blackbeard and his contemporaries operated inside the Atlantic slave economy and profited from it, and any account that presents these men as liberators is misrepresenting the record. A minority of pirate crews included black men serving as full members with a vote and a share, and that is real and remarkable. It coexisted with the sale of other black people as cargo, by the same crews, in the same months. In May 1718, Blackbeard did the thing that made him notorious. He anchored his squadron off the bar at Charleston, South Carolina, and stopped everything going in or out. For close to a week, the principal port of a prosperous colony was simply shut. He took ships as they came, held prominent passengers hostage, and sent a demand ashore. What he demanded was a chest of medicines, not gold, not silver, medical supplies worth a few £100. Historians have generally read this as evidence that his crew was suffering from disease, quite possibly syphilis, and that the mercury preparations of the day were what he needed. The negotiations dragged on because the man he sent ashore got drunk, and Blackbeard came within a day of executing his hostages before the chest arrived. He then released them, having taken their valuables and, in a detail that reads as pure theatre, most of their clothes, so that a group of Charleston gentlemen came ashore in their underwear. It was an audacious operation, and it was the peak of his career. Within weeks, he began dismantling everything he had built. He took his squadron north to Topsail Inlet, now Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina, and there, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground on a sandbar and was lost. A consort sent to help, also grounded. Whether this was an accident of pilotage in genuinely difficult water or a deliberate act has been argued ever since. Several of his own men said afterwards that he had done it on purpose to break up the company, because a large crew meant small shares, and shortly afterwards he sailed away in a small sloop with a chosen few and the pick of the goods, leaving a group of men marooned on a sandbank. That is not the behavior of a man committed to pirate democracy. It is the behavior of a man cashing out. He then went to the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, and accepted the king's pardon. This was a real policy, which we will come to shortly, and for a time he lived quietly at Bath, a tiny settlement on the Pamlico. He is recorded as having married, though the story that she was his 14th wife and was treated appallingly comes from the general history and is uncorroborated. He was on visiting terms with the governor and with the customs collector, Tobias Knight. He also went back to sea and took ships, and then presented them as salvage or as legitimate finds, with the governor's court obligingly agreeing. The arrangement was corrupt, and everybody in Virginia knew it. Which brings us to Alexander Spotswood, Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, who had no jurisdiction whatsoever in North Carolina, and decided to act anyway. Spotswood organized the operation privately, hiring 2 shallow draft sloops because naval vessels could not get into the Sounds, and putting them under Lieutenant Robert Maynard of HMS Pearl with around 60 men. They went south in November 1718 and found Blackbeard anchored at Ocracoke Inlet on the night of the 21st. The battle the next morning was short, confused and vicious. Blackbeard's sloop grounded briefly. Maynard's vessels came on in the shallow water. Blackbeard fired a broadside of langrage that killed or wounded a large number of Maynard's men in an instant, which is exactly what that ammunition was designed to do. Maynard then hid the remainder of his crew below decks and left only a few visible, so that when the pirates boarded, believing the sloop nearly emptied, the concealed men came up behind them. The fight on that deck was hand-to-hand. Maynard and Blackbeard came together directly. Maynard's pistol ball struck him, and he kept coming. Maynard's sword broke against something. A Highlander in the naval crew cut Blackbeard across the neck. He went down at last, and the examination afterwards counted 5 pistol wounds and around 20 cuts. Maynard cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit as proof for the reward, and sailed back to Virginia with it there. The head was later displayed on a pole at the mouth of the Hampton River, at a place still called Blackbeard's Point. He had been an active pirate for about 2 years. The wreck of a ship believed to be the Queen Anne's Revenge was located off Beaufort in 1996 and has been excavated ever since, producing anchors, cannon, gold dust, medical instruments, including a urethral syringe consistent with mercury treatment for syphilis, and enormous quantities of ordinary shipboard material. The identification is accepted by most researchers, though it has been questioned, since no object has been recovered bearing the ship's name. What the site does provide is the thing the legend never had, which is physical fact. Real iron, real lead, real weights and measures, lying in 20-odd feet of water under the sand where they have been for 300 years, going quietly green. While all that was happening on the American coast, the tide was already turning in the Bahamas, and the men who had made Nassau what it was were scattering in different directions and towards different ends. Let the pace slow for a moment before we take them one at a time. It is late in a warm anchorage somewhere in the Exumas, a chain of low cays running southeast from New Providence, with water between them the color of green glass. The wind has dropped with the sun the way it does. The sea has gone almost flat, moving only in a long, slow-breathing swell that lifts the sloop and sets her down again. There is a heron somewhere along the shore, making its one dry complaint. A hatch is open, and a lantern is swinging below, sending its light back and forth across the deckhead. Two men are talking quietly at the rail without much to say, watching the last color go out of the western sky. That is where these people spent most of their lives. Not fighting, waiting. Charles Vane was the one nobody liked. He is a genuinely unpleasant figure, and even sources sympathetic to pirates struggle with him. He tortured prisoners without the practical justification his predecessors would have offered. He cheated his own crews, which was the one thing pirate society could not tolerate, since the entire arrangement rested on the honest division of plunder. When the king's pardon reached Nassau in 1718, he refused it in the most theatrical way available, setting fire to a captured French ship and sending her blazing into the harbor at the incoming Royal Navy escort, then slipping out the shallow western channel while everyone dealt with the fire. His end came from within. Faced with a French warship that turned out to be far stronger than expected, he declined to engage. His quartermaster, a man named Jack Rackham, called him a coward, put it to a vote, and won. Vane was deposed and set adrift in a small sloop with the handful who stayed loyal. He was later wrecked in a hurricane, marooned on an island, rescued by a passing ship whose captain recognized him, and hanged at Port Royal in 1721. He is said to have shown no repentance at all, which at least was consistent. John Rackham, called Calico Jack for the printed cotton clothing he liked, is a curious case of a minor pirate with an enormous afterlife. His actual record is thin. He took small vessels, fishing boats and coasters, mostly in Jamaican waters. He was not feared, he was not rich, but he flew a flag of a skull above two crossed cutlasses, which has become, more than any other, the image the entire world now uses for piracy. And he had aboard his sloop 2 women whose story has never stopped being retold. Anne Bonny was, according to the general history, the illegitimate daughter of an Irish lawyer who emigrated to Charleston, where he prospered. She married a poor sailor against her father's wishes, went with him to Nassau, and there left him for Rackham. Mary Red had reportedly been dressed as a boy from childhood by a mother concealing a legitimacy problem, had served in the army in Flanders, had married a fellow soldier, and after his death had gone back into men's clothes and to sea, where her ship was taken by pirates and she joined them. Both of these life stories follow a shape that was popular in early 18th century print culture, the female warrior narrative, of which there were many. That does not mean they are false. It does mean that the details, the childhood disguises, the dramatic revelations, are exactly what a professional writer would have added. What is documented, and this is the crucial point, is the trial. In November 1720, At St. Jago de la Vega in Jamaica, Anne Bonny and Mary Read were tried for piracy alongside Rackham's crew. The court record survives. Witnesses testified that both women were active, armed, and as ready as any man aboard. One witness, a woman named Dorothy Thomas, who had been captured by them, said she knew them to be women by the size of their breasts, and that they had wanted her killed so she could not testify. They were convicted and sentenced to hang, and then both of them pleaded their bellies. Pregnancy stayed in execution under English law, and the court granted the plea. Mary Read died in prison in April 1721, and the burial record exists. The cause is not recorded, but fever was endemic in the Jamaican gales, and childbed is also possible. Anne Bonny simply disappears from the record. She was not executed. There is no burial entry. Later researchers have proposed that her wealthy father intervened and that she returned to South Carolina, married and lived to old age. And there is a genealogical case for this that some historians find persuasive and others do not. It rests on circumstantial evidence. Rackham and the men were hanged. The account of their last exchange, in which Anne Bonny is supposed to have told him that if he had fought like a man, he need not hang like a dog, comes from the general history and is unverifiable, and is also far too good a line to give up entirely. There is a detail in the trial that says a great deal about how the capture happened. When the Jamaican sloop came alongside, most of Rackham's crew were below and incapable, having spent the day drinking with a party of turtle hunters. The two women were among the very few on deck, attempting to resist. Whatever else is uncertain, that much is in the record, and it was recorded by people who had no reason to flatter them. Then there is Stede Bonnet, who is either the saddest or the funniest figure in the whole story, depending on your mood. Bonnet was a well-off sugar planter on Barbados, a man of some education, married, in his late 20s or early 30s, with no maritime experience whatsoever. In 1717, he did something that nobody in his position had ever done. He bought a ship with his own money, hired a crew with wages, and went to sea to be a pirate. Buying a pirate ship and paying wages is such a complete misunderstanding of the entire enterprise that his crew must have wondered what they had joined. Pirates did not buy ships, they took them. Pirates were not paid, they took shares. The general history says he did it to escape his wife, and reports that his neighbors thought he had gone mad. It is possible he was in some genuine crisis. Midlife collapses were not invented in the 20th century. He was, predictably, hopeless. His crew had no confidence in him. He was badly wounded early on, and when he fell in with Blackbeard, the older man simply took over, putting one of his own officers aboard Bonnet's ship, and keeping Bonnet as a sort of guest, walking about in his dressing gown, reading his books, while other men sailed his vessel. It is a genuinely strange image, the gentleman amateur being humored aboard his own command. He accepted the pardon, then went back to piracy under the transparent alias of Captain Thomas, and was hunted down in the Cape Fear River in September 1718 by an expedition from South Carolina under Colonel William Rhett. The fight there was a long, grinding, almost farcical business, in which both sides went aground on falling water and sat helplessly within musket shot of each other for hours, until the tide floated Rhett off first. Bonnet was taken to Charleston, escaped, was recaptured, and wrote a letter to the governor, begging for his life, in terms so abject that it is uncomfortable to read. He offered to have his own arms and legs cut off if he might be spared. He was hanged at White Point in December 1718, holding a small bunch of flowers, which someone thought to record. He had been at sea, in total, for about a year and a half. Of all the people in this story, he is the one who most clearly should never have been there at all. And now we come to the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, and one of the most successful in all of recorded history, a man that almost nobody outside the subject has ever heard of. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, though he was born John Roberts in Pembrokeshire in Wales around 1682 in a village called Casnewydd Bach, and he was almost certainly a Welsh speaker. Black Bart is a nickname that appears to have been attached to him long after his death, mostly by Welsh writers pleased to have a candidate. For most of his life he was an entirely ordinary seaman. He worked his way up to third mate, which is a respectable position requiring navigational competence, and in 1719 he was serving aboard a slave ship called the Princess, off the coast of what is now Ghana. In June of that year, the Princess was taken by pirates under Howell Davis, another Welshman, and Roberts was among the men forced to join. He did not want to be there. He said so. 6 weeks later, Davis was killed in an ambush on the Portuguese island of Principe, walking into a trap while attempting a confidence trick that had worked before. The company needed a new captain, and they elected the reluctant 37-year-old navigator who had been with them for a month and a half. The reasoning, according to the account we have, was that he was the best seaman among them and that he had a presence. Roberts is supposed to have accepted with a remark to the effect that since he had dipped his hands in muddy water and must be a pirate, it was better to be a commander than a common man. What followed is almost absurd. Over roughly 3 years, Bartholomew Roberts and his companies captured somewhere between 400 and 470 vessels. The exact figure depends on how you count, and different historians reach different totals from the same sources, but even the conservative estimates dwarf everyone else. Blackbeard, over a comparable career, took perhaps 40. Roberts took 10 times as many. He did it by moving constantly across the entire Atlantic, which very few pirates attempted. From West Africa he crossed to Brazil, where in the Bay of All Saints he sailed his single ship into the middle of a Portuguese fleet of 42 merchantmen, lying with 2 warships of 70 guns each, quietly came alongside one vessel, asked her master which of the fleet was the richest, was told, and then took that one and sailed away with it before the warships could get underway. The prize contained sugar, skins, tobacco, and a quantity of gold coin, and among the items was a cross, set with diamonds intended for the King of Portugal, which Roberts is said to have worn afterwards. From Brazil he went north to the Caribbean and worked the Windward Islands so thoroughly that trade effectively stopped. Barbados and Martinique both sent ships against him and both failed, which is why he made that flag showing himself standing on their governors' skulls. He raided the Newfoundland fishery at Trepassey in 1720, sailing into a harbor containing 22 vessels and hundreds of fishing boats, whose crews all fled ashore, and taking or burning the lot. Then back across to Africa, then back again. He was, by the standards of his trade, remarkably disciplined, and the articles his company signed reflect his personality. No gambling for money aboard, lights out at 8, weapons kept clean and inspected, no women aboard on pain of death, deserters marooned, a share system rigidly enforced. He himself did not drink. In a profession defined by alcohol, Bartholomew Roberts drank tea. He is also described as dressing spectacularly in action, in a rich crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, a gold chain with a diamond cross around his neck, and a sword in his hand with 2 pairs of pistols slung on a silk sling over his shoulders. He kept the Sabbath for his musicians. He was, by several accounts, personally courteous to captured masters, unless they had mistreated their own crews, in which case he was not, and he was capable of great cruelty. When the governor of Martinique's ship fell into his hands, he hanged the man from a yardarm. After the loss of some of his men at Barbados, he burned a captured vessel with people aboard. The trial records from Cape Coast Castle contain testimony of prisoners flogged, of a ship of enslaved people burned in her hold when a ransom was refused, an act of such gratuitous horror that it is difficult to set beside the tea and the courtesy, and yet both are in the record. That is the thing about Roberts, and perhaps about the entire subject. He was a disciplined professional and a mass thief, and, on occasion, a murderer of helpless people, and these were the same man in the same week. The end came in February 1722 off Cape Lopez, in what is now Gabon. The Royal Navy had sent HMS Swallow, a 50-gun ship under Captain Challoner Ogle, specifically to find him. Ogle came upon Roberts's squadron at anchor, and when the pirates saw a large ship approaching, he deliberately turned away as if fleeing, drawing one of Roberts's vessels out after him. Once out of sight of the anchorage, he turned and destroyed her. He then came back for the flagship. It was early morning on the 10th of February. Most of Roberts's crew were drunk, having spent the night celebrating a capture. Roberts himself, dressed in his crimson, took breakfast and then went on deck. His plan was sound. Sail straight past the Swallow, taking one broadside, and then run for the open sea where his ship's speed would tell. He very nearly did it. At almost the first exchange, a charge of grape shot came across the deck and struck him in the throat. He fell against the tackle of a gun. A man at the helm thought at first that he was resting. His crew, following his standing instruction, threw his body overboard in its full finery, waited, before the Navy could take it. Bartholomew Roberts, the most prolific pirate in the history of the Atlantic, was never buried and has no grave. He is somewhere out there still, in the warm green water off the coast of Africa. The fight went out of his company almost immediately. Some 160 men were taken and shipped to Cape Coast Castle, where they were tried in an admiralty court, sitting in the very fortress that served as one of the principal holding points for the transatlantic slave trade. 52 were hanged. 20 were sentenced to indentured servitude in the mines of the Royal African Company. 17 were sent to the Marshalsea in London, of whom most died on the passage. A large number were acquitted on the grounds that they had been forced men, which many genuinely were, since Roberts had press-ganged skilled seamen, exactly as the Navy did. The trial transcripts from Cape Coast are among the best sources we have for how these ships actually operated, because the accused had every incentive to describe the mechanics in detail while distancing themselves from the acts. And with Roberts's death, contemporaries said, the trade was broken. That is not quite true, but it is close enough. He had been the last great figure, and his was the last large company. The rest was mopping up. 2 more men, and then we will come back to the Caribbean and stay there. Both of these belong slightly earlier, to the Eastern trade rather than the Western, and both of them shaped the Golden Age enormously. One got away with everything, the other got away with almost nothing, and was hanged for it anyway. Henry Every, sometimes written Avery, was a Devon man, and, like most of them, a professional seaman. In 1694 he was first mate aboard a ship called the Charles II, part of an expedition fitted out under Spanish license, and lying at Corunna, in northern Spain, where the whole enterprise had stalled. The men had not been paid for months. The organizers were absent. Nobody would answer their letters. So one night in May, the crew took the ship, put the captain over the side into a boat with those who would not join, renamed her the Fancy, and sailed for the Indian Ocean. Every did something clever before he left. He wrote a public letter to English shipping, declaring that he would not harm English vessels, only foreign ones. It bought him passage and it bought him goodwill, and it would prove worthless. He made his way round the Cape, raided along the East African coast, and then took up station at the mouth of the Red Sea, in the strait called Bab el-Mandeb, waiting for the annual pilgrim convoy returning from Mecca to Surat in Mughal India. These were enormous ships, carrying pilgrims of great wealth and the accumulated proceeds of trade. Several other pirate vessels gathered there with him, English and colonial, and they agreed to work together. In September 1695, they found the convoy. Most escaped in the dark. 2 did not. The second and larger was the Ganji Sawai, the exceeding treasure, which belonged to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb himself. She was a huge vessel with perhaps 80 guns and hundreds of armed men aboard, far stronger than the fancy on paper. She lost through misfortune. One of her own cannon burst on the first discharge, killing her gunners and starting a panic. A lucky shot from the fancy brought down her mainmast. The pirates boarded and fought for a long time, and when it was over, they held the richest single prize ever taken by an English pirate. The figures are unreliable and enormous. Contemporary accounts speak of hundreds of thousands of pounds sterling in gold, silver, and jewels, a sum equivalent to a substantial share of the annual revenue of some European states. Each ordinary member of the crew received something like £1,000, when a skilled tradesman in England earned perhaps £20 a year. It was, in real terms, one of the largest robberies ever committed. What happened aboard that ship afterwards was worse than the fight. Survivors' testimony collected by Mughal officials described several days of systematic rape and torture of the passengers, including women of high rank, and a number of suicides. English sources of the period are considerably vaguer about this, for obvious reasons, and some later English writers omitted it entirely. Indian sources did not. The political consequences were immediate and severe. Aurangzeb was enraged and threatened the East India Company's entire position in India. The company's factories were shut and its officials imprisoned. The English government, terrified of losing the Indian trade, offered the largest reward yet seen for the capture of a private individual, and issued what is generally described as the first worldwide manhunt in history, with proclamations circulated across 4 continents. They did not catch him. The crew scattered. Some were arrested in England and Ireland and tried. The first jury acquitted them, apparently unwilling to hang men for robbing foreigners, which caused such official fury that a second trial was arranged on different charges, and 6 were hanged. Henry Every himself vanished. He was last reliably placed in Ireland in 1696. After that, there is nothing. Legends grew immediately that he had become a king in Madagascar with a fleet and a palace, that he had died penniless in Devon, having been cheated of his jewels by Bristol merchants, that he had changed his name and lived quietly on the proceeds for 40 years. A play was written about him in London within a few years. A fictitious book of his adventures was published as fact. He is the reason so many men went to sea in the following decades, believing that one good voyage could set them up for life. The Every story was the advertisement for the Golden Age, and it was exceptionally true. William Kidd is the opposite case, and his is the one that should trouble anybody who thinks the law in this period was straightforward. Kidd was a Scot, a respectable and successful shipmaster living in New York, with a wealthy wife and a pew in Trinity Church. He had served as a privateer in the Caribbean with credit. He was, in every sense, an establishment figure. In 1695, he was engaged in a scheme backed by some of the most powerful men in England, including several senior ministers and, at a distance, the king himself, to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean and take French shipping. The investors would share the proceeds. The arrangement was kept quiet because it was politically explosive, a private profit venture involving officers of state. Almost everything went wrong. He lost a third of his crew to press gang seizure before he even left England, and had to replace them in New York with harder men. Disease killed dozens more. He found no pirates and no French prizes. His crew, who were on a no-purchase, no-pay basis, and therefore earning nothing, grew mutinous. In a quarrel, he struck his gunner, William Moore, with an iron-bound bucket, and Moore died the next day. Under pressure, he began taking ships he should not have, and then in 1698, he took a large Armenian-owned vessel called the Quedar Merchant, which was carrying an extremely valuable cargo, and which was sailing under French passes. That detail was his entire defense. A French pass made her a lawful prize under his commission. He took the passes and kept them. When he learned he had been declared a pirate, he sailed for New York, expecting his powerful backers to protect him. Instead, he found that the political weather had changed completely. His patrons were now under attack in Parliament, and the safest thing for them was for Kidd to be a straightforward criminal who had deceived them. He was arrested, held in Newgate for over a year, in conditions that broke his health, and tried in London in 1701. The French passes, which were his evidence, were not produced at his trial. He was convicted of piracy and of the murder of William Moore. The passes were rediscovered in the Public Record Office in the late 19th century. They had existed all along. Whether their production would have saved him is arguable. His conduct was at best reckless, and the Moore killing was separate. But the trial was not a fair one by any reasonable standard, and Kidd was hanged at Execution Dock at Wapping in May 1701, at a hanging where the rope broke on the first attempt, and he had to be strung up again. His body was tarred, hung in an iron cage at Tilbury, and left there for years as a warning to sailors coming up the Thames. Before he sailed home, he had buried a portion of the treasure on Gardiner's Island off Long Island, with the owner's knowledge, intending it as a bargaining chip. It was dug up by the authorities within weeks and used as evidence against him. That one small, thoroughly documented, entirely unsuccessful act of concealment is the historical seed from which every buried treasure story in the English language has grown. Which brings us neatly to the myths. Buried treasure, first, since we are already there. Pirates did not bury treasure. The idea is almost entirely fictional, and once you think about the economics for 30 seconds, it becomes obvious why. A pirate company divided its plunder immediately, by agreed shares, usually at the first safe opportunity. That was the whole point of the articles, and men watched the division closely because they did not trust each other. Nobody was going to agree to bury the collective proceeds in a hole on a beach and then sail away, leaving it where any one of them might return alone. More importantly, most plunder was not treasure at all. It was cargo. Sugar, indigo, dyewood, cloth, hides, spices, ivory, cocoa, wine, naval stores, tools, medicine, and above all, ships themselves. You cannot bury 40 hogsheads of sugar. You have to sell them, quickly, to a merchant who will not ask questions. And that is why places like Nassau and Port Royal, and, quietly, half the ports of colonial North America, mattered so much. Piracy was a distribution problem more than an acquisition problem. And when coin did come in, it went straight out again. Pirates spent with a recklessness that shocked everyone who saw it. There are repeated accounts of men going through in a fortnight what would have kept a family for a decade. Exquemelin describes a buccaneer at Port Royal buying a whole cask of wine, setting it in the street, and forcing passers-by to drink with him. Another bought a barrel of butter and threw handfuls of it at people. These were men who had every reason to believe they would be dead within 2 years, and they behaved accordingly. The buried treasure story we have comes from Kidd's small deposit on Gardiner's Island, amplified by 100 years of newspaper speculation, and then fixed permanently in the imagination by Robert Louis Stevenson. Walking the Plank is fiction too. It appears in no reliable account of the Golden Age. There is a single much later 19th century incident sometimes cited, and there are cases of prisoners being thrown overboard, which required no plank and no ceremony. Pirates who wanted to kill a man simply killed him. The plank is a piece of theatre invented for the page and then for the stage. Marooning, on the other hand, is entirely real, and it was the standard severe punishment in the articles. A man was put ashore on a sandbank or an uninhabited quay with a bottle of water, a pistol, and a single shot. The pistol was not mercy exactly. It was a statement. Everyone understood what it was for. Marooning appears repeatedly in trial testimony. and it was feared far more than flogging. The parrot is more interesting than it looks. No Golden Age source describes a pirate with a parrot on his shoulder. However, sailors of every kind absolutely did bring exotic animals home from the tropics because they sold extremely well in European ports. Parrots and monkeys were standard sailors' cargo, easy to keep alive on a long passage and worth good money in London or Amsterdam. So a pirate with a parrot aboard is entirely plausible. A pirate with a parrot as a permanent shoulder ornament is Long John Silver, and nobody else. The eye patch has produced a persistent modern theory that it was worn to keep one eye adapted to darkness for going below decks. It is an elegant idea. There is no historical evidence for it whatsoever. It appears to have been invented in the 20th century and repeated until it acquired an air of fact. What is true is that eye injuries were common at sea, from splinters, powder flash and disease, so some sailors certainly did wear patches, for the ordinary reason. Hooks and wooden legs follow the same logic. Amputation was common, and prosthetics existed, though a peg leg was a real and rather awkward piece of equipment, and a working hook of the pantomime kind was not standard. The pirate, defined by his missing parts, is largely a composite drawn from Stevenson and from the fact that maritime work maimed a great many men. The accent, the growling R, is the single most enjoyable falsehood in the whole subject, because we can date it almost exactly. It comes from the actor Robert Newton, a Dorset man, playing Long John Silver in the Disney film of Treasure Island in 1950, and then Blackbeard shortly after. He leaned into a broad West Country accent and enriched it considerably. Since Bristol and the Devon and Cornwall ports were genuinely major sources of seamen, the choice had a certain logic, but the specific voice the world now imitates is one performance by one actor in one film. Before 1950, pirates in fiction sounded like whatever the author wanted. Ships also did not have a single national character in the way films suggest. Pirate crews were strikingly mixed. Trial records and depositions show English, Welsh, Scots, Irish, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Danish, Swedish, and colonial American men aboard the same vessels, along with a significant number of Africans and men of African descent. Estimates for the proportion of black crew members on Golden Age pirate ships range from around a quarter to a third on some vessels, based on the surviving muster and trial evidence, though the figure varies enormously between ships and the sources are patchy. The status of those men varied too, and this is where honesty is required. On some ships they were full members with a vote and an equal share, and there is testimony to that effect from men who had no reason to invent it. On others they were kept as servants or as labor, or were treated as goods and sold at the next opportunity. Both practices existed, sometimes aboard the same vessel in the same year, and any account that presents only one of them is telling half a story. Which brings us to the uncomfortable center of the economics. The wealth of the Caribbean in this period rested on sugar, and sugar rested on slavery. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint Domingue, and the smaller islands had been converted, in the space of a few decades, from mixed smallholder colonies into vast plantation systems worked by enslaved Africans under a regime of appalling mortality. The cane had to be cut and crushed and boiled within hours, which made the harvest a period of continuous, dangerous labor in extreme heat around open furnaces. Death rates were so high that the plantations depended on constant new imports rather than on any natural increase. That system produced the sugar, the molasses, and the rum. It produced the coin that flowed through Port Royal and Bridgetown and Havana. It filled the ships that pirates took. Every hogshead of sugar in a captured hold was the product of it, and pirates were part of that economy, not opposed to it. They robbed slave ships and sold the people aboard. They used enslaved labor on their own vessels. A handful of them offered a genuine freedom to a handful of men, and that is real and worth recording. But it was not a program, and it was not a principle. I raise this not to lecture, but because the subject invites a certain cheerful forgetting, and the cheerfulness is easier if you do not look at what the ships were carrying. The Caribbean of the Golden Age was beautiful beyond description, and it was built on a crime of a scale that piracy never approached. Both of those sentences are true at the same time, and holding them together is, I think, the only honest way to enjoy the story at all. Let us step away from the ledgers for a while and simply travel, because the geography of this story is one of the most beautiful on Earth, and we have been rather businesslike about it. Begin with Cuba, which is enormous. It is by far the largest island in the Caribbean, 750 miles long, and it has almost every landscape a country could want. Along the northern coast, the land is low and green with mangrove and mahogany. Inland to the west stand the mogotes of Viñales, strange rounded limestone towers rising sheer out of flat red soil, hollow with caves, wrapped in cloud at dawn. In the southeast, the Sierra Maestra runs up over 6,000 feet. Rivers, caves, savanna, hardwood forest, and around the whole thing, a fringe of cays and reef. Havana, in the early 18th century, was the strongest fortified city in the Americas, and it looked it. El Morro stood on the rock at the harbor entrance, with its lighthouse and its batteries. A great iron chain could be drawn across the Narrows at night, floated on timbers, so that nothing entered without permission. Behind the walls, the city had cathedrals and convents, and the shipyard that built some of the finest vessels in the Spanish Navy, using Cuban hardwood so dense and durable that ships built there outlasted anything from Europe. Stand on that harbor wall at 4 in the morning, in the hour when even a port town goes quiet. The water inside the bag is black and absolutely still, and the lights of the anchored fleet lie on it in long, unbroken lines, because there is no swell in here to break them. Out past the Narrows you can hear the ocean working against the rocks, a slow, heavy pulse. The air is warm and smells of salt and stone and the previous evening's cooking. A bell strikes somewhere aboard a ship, and another answers. Somewhere on the ramparts a sentry is walking, unhurried. And above it all, the sky is absolutely full of stars, so many that the familiar constellations are hard to pick out among them, hanging over the harbor and the fleet, and the whole enormous sleeping island. Then Hispaniola, second largest, and the strangest political arrangement in the region. The Spanish held the east, sleepy and cattle-raising, and comparatively poor. The French held the west, where they had turned the plains around Cap Français and Léogâne into the most profitable colony on earth. Saint-Domingue produced more sugar and coffee than any other territory in the world, and it did so through a slave regime so lethal that it consumed lives faster than almost anywhere else in the Americas. That colony would, at the end of the century, become Haiti through the only successful large-scale slave revolution in history. The pirates of the Golden Age sailed past its coast without any inkling of that. The island itself is spectacular. 4 separate mountain ranges. Pico Duarte, the highest point in the whole Caribbean, over 10,000 feet, with pine forest near the top and genuine cold at night. Deep, fertile valleys. Rivers running down through gorges to the sea, and along the north coast, the long beaches and the shallow bays, where the buccaneers had first made their camps, still empty, still fringed with palm. Then the long arc of the Lesser Antilles, running down to the south, each island its own small world. Volcanic peaks wrapped in rainforest on Dominica and St. Vincent and St. Lucia, so steep that the interior remained effectively unconquered for a very long time. Flat coral platforms like Barbados and Antigua, dry, easily cleared, and therefore turned to cane first and hardest. Anguilla, so low it is barely there. Saba, which is a single mountain sticking out of deep water with no beach at all, and villages perched on its shoulders. Between them, the passages, Anegada, Sombrero, the Dominica Channel, the Martinique Passage. Every ship coming into the Caribbean from Europe or Africa came through one of them, and every one of them was a place where a sloop might lie in the lee of an island watching the horizon. And the Bahamas to the north, which are not really Caribbean at all in a strict sense, but belong to the story completely. 700 low green islands scattered over banks of white sand, with water so shallow and clear across the Great Bahama Bank that a boat seems to be flying. Blue holes drop suddenly out of that whiteness, circular voids of deep dark water hundreds of feet down, and sailors gave them a wide berth for reasons that were probably superstitious and possibly sensible. Endless quays with no names, coves and creeks and mangrove channels where a small vessel could vanish entirely. Take a moment with one of those anchorages, since we are here. You are lying in a hammock strung under an awning on the deck of a sloop. The sun went down an hour ago, behind a low green quay. There is no wind at all now, and the water is like oil, moving in one long, slow swell that comes in from the ocean side and lifts the boat and sets her down, lifts her and sets her down, with a rhythm so regular that within minutes you stop noticing it, and your body simply moves with it. The anchor cable creaks once and then goes quiet. A fish jumps somewhere off to starboard, and the rings of it spread out and out and out until they lose themselves. The mangroves along the shore are full of small sounds, water moving among roots, something rustling, a bird making one short call, and then thinking better of it. A frog starts up, the first stars come out over the mast, and then, in the space of 20 minutes, the whole sky fills. There is a lantern hanging in the shrouds, turned low, and it swings very slightly, and its light goes back and forth across the deck planking, and the coiled rope, and the sleeping shapes of men. The smell is salt and warm wood and tar, and the faint green vegetable smell of the mangroves. Someone snores briefly and stops, and the swell keeps coming in, patient, from an ocean that has been doing this for as long as there has been an ocean, lifting the boat and setting her down, lifting her and setting her down. Nothing in the world requires anything of you here. If you are still awake, that is perfectly all right. There is more to come, and it will keep. But if you have started to go, let go of the rest of it. The story does not need you to finish it. The Golden Age lasted about 10 years. That is worth repeating, because the cultural footprint is so enormous that people assume it went on for generations. From the wrecking of the treasure fleet in 1715 to the death of Roberts in 1722 is 7 years. Add a few on either side, and you have the whole of it. It ended because a group of governments decided that it should, and then acted with unusual coherence. The first instrument was mercy. In September 1717, George I issued a proclamation offering a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered himself to a colonial governor by a stated deadline, for offenses committed before a stated date. It was extended more than once. This was not sentiment. It was policy of a very calculating sort. Every man who took the pardon was a man who no longer had to be hunted, and, more importantly, the offer split the pirate community against itself, because those who accepted immediately became potential informers and even hunters of those who did not. Hundreds accepted, and a great many of them then went straight back to sea, because the pardon gave them nothing to live on and the alternative was still starvation. The second instrument was a man, and he arrived in Nassau in July 1718. Woodes Rogers was a Bristol merchant and mariner who had already had one extraordinary life. Between 1708 and 1711, he had commanded a privateering expedition around the world, an enormous undertaking that included capturing a Manila galleon off California and, on the way, rescuing a Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk, who had been left alone on an island off Chile for over 4 years, at his own request, after a dispute with his captain. Rogers wrote the voyage up in a book, A Cruising Voyage Round the World, published in 1712, and Selkirk's story fed directly into Robinson Crusoe. Rogers came home famous, and, thanks to a lawsuit brought by his own investors, largely ruined. He had a face disfigured by a musket ball taken through the jaw in a fight with the galleon, and he had an idea, which was that the Bahamas could be made profitable if somebody cleared the pirates out. He formed a company, obtained a royal appointment as governor, and sailed with a small squadron and a copy of the king's pardon. His arrival is one of the few genuinely cinematic moments in this history, and it was, characteristically, decided by seamanship rather than gunfire. He entered the harbor by both channels at once to prevent escape. Charles Vane, as we have seen, sent a burning ship at him and slipped out. Everybody else watched and decided. By morning, the majority of the men on that beach had chosen the pardon. Some, including Hornigold, went further and took service under Rogers, actively hunting their former colleagues, which they did with considerable effectiveness because they knew exactly where everyone hid. Hornigold was later lost in a hurricane on the Mexican coast. Rogers's governorship was, in practical terms, brutally hard. He had almost no money, since the company backing him proved unwilling to spend. Yellow fever killed a large proportion of the soldiers he had brought. Spain was at war with Britain again, and mounted an invasion attempt he had to repel with a garrison largely composed of former pirates. He rebuilt the fort, laid out the town properly, established a court, and in December 1718 tried and hanged 8 men who had taken the pardon and gone back on account, publicly, at the harbor front, in front of the men who had been their shipmates a few months earlier. That was the point at which everyone understood that it was over. Rogers went bankrupt, was imprisoned for debt in England, was later reappointed and returned, and died at Nassau in 1732. The motto he adopted for the Bahamas, expelled pirates and restored commerce, remained the colony's official motto until 1973. He is one of the few people in this story who set out to do a specific thing and did it, and it destroyed his health and his finances in the process. The third instrument was the Royal Navy, which after 1718 was deployed in the Caribbean and off West Africa in a sustained way it had not been before. Station ships were assigned. Small shallow draft vessels were purchased locally because it had become obvious that a fourth rate cannot chase a sloop over a sandbank. Captains like Challoner Ogle were given specific quarry and specific rewards. Ogle received a knighthood for taking Roberts, the only naval officer ever knighted specifically for defeating pirates. The fourth instrument was legal, and it was decisive. Historically, piracy had to be tried in England under Admiralty jurisdiction, which meant shipping prisoners and witnesses across the Atlantic at enormous expense and considerable risk of the case collapsing. Legislation extended in this period allowed vice-admiralty courts in the colonies to try piracy cases on the spot, without a jury, with a panel of officials. That is why the men from Roberts's company were tried at Cape Coast Castle in Africa and hanged there rather than in London. The effect was that capture now led reliably and quickly to execution, close to the scene, in front of the maritime community. And the executions were meant to be seen. In London they took place at Execution Dock at Wapping, at the low water mark, because the Admiralty's jurisdiction ran to where the tide reached. The condemned were brought down through the streets behind a silver oar carried by an official. After hanging, the bodies were left until 3 tides had washed over them. The worst offenders were then tarred and hung in iron cages at Tilbury or Blackwall, or on the Kent shore, where every ship coming up the river would pass them. Kidd hung at Tilbury for years. The same practice was followed in the colonies. Bodies in irons at the entrances to Charleston and Port Royal and Nassau, visible from the deck of every incoming vessel. It is easy to be revolted by this, and one should be. It is also worth understanding what it was for. The state was competing for the loyalty of a population of seamen, and it could not outbid piracy on wages or on freedom, so it competed on terror. It said, in the most literal way available, "Look what happens." The fifth reason is the least dramatic and possibly the most important. The economics changed. Merchant shipping recovered from the post-war slump. Wages rose again. The rapid growth of the sugar and slave trades meant more berths. Insurance markets developed, and underwriters pressed hard for convoying and for naval protection. The colonial merchants who had quietly bought pirate cargo found that they now had more to lose than to gain, and the fences dried up. A pirate who cannot sell his sugar has no business. By the mid-1720s there was almost nothing left. A few stragglers were hunted down. Edward Lowe, one of the genuinely sadistic figures of the tail end, and a man whose cruelty appalled even his contemporaries, disappeared around 1724 in circumstances that were never established. There were later outbreaks in the Caribbean and elsewhere, well into the 19th century, but the particular world of Nassau and the black flags and the articles and the elected captains was finished. Of the thousands of men who went on account in those 10 years, the overwhelming majority ended in one of three ways: hanged, drowned or killed, or vanished into obscurity so completely that no record of them survives at all. Almost none of them got rich and stayed rich. Henry Every is the exception that proves the rule, and even he disappeared so thoroughly that we do not know whether he enjoyed a penny of it. And yet here we are, 300 years later, still talking about them. There is a real puzzle in this. Thousands of highwaymen, bandits, smugglers and river thieves operated in the same century, some of them famous in their own time, and almost none of them have survived in the imagination. Why these particular criminals, in this particular decade, on this particular sea? Part of the answer is that the story was written down immediately by people who understood how to sell it. The General History of the Pirates appeared in 1724, only 2 years after Roberts died, while the trials were still in living memory. It went through multiple editions and a much expanded second volume, and it did something no dry court record could. It gave these men characters. Blackbeard the terrifying showman, Roberts the austere disciplinarian, Bonnet the deluded gentleman, Bonnie and Reed the impossible women. Whether or not those characterizations were accurate, they were vivid, and they are the reason we can still name them. The book was reprinted continuously for 2 centuries and was the source that every subsequent writer went to. The most important of those writers was Robert Louis Stevenson, and Treasure Island, published in 1883, did not so much draw on the pirate legend as replace it. Almost everything the modern world thinks it knows about pirates comes from that one book: the treasure map with an X, the black spot, the one-legged sea cook with the parrot, the chest and the dead man, and the bottle of rum, which is a piece of doggerel Stevenson wrote himself, and which people have believed to be a genuine sea song ever since. The idea that treasure is buried on an island and can be found. The sea chest full of coins. The tropical island as a place of secrets rather than a place where people live. Stevenson began it as a game, drawing a map to entertain his stepson on a wet holiday in Scotland, and then writing a story to explain the map. He said afterwards that the whole book grew out of that drawing. He also freely admitted his debts to the general history and to a real 17th century account of a Caribbean voyage. Long John Silver is the crucial invention. Before Silver, fictional pirates were mostly villains or monsters. Silver is charming, funny, intelligent, treacherous, oddly principled, and genuinely fond of the boy he is prepared to kill. He is the origin of the ambiguous pirate, the one the audience half wants to succeed, and everything from Captain Hook to Jack Sparrow descends from him. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan came in 1904 and made a further alteration by putting pirates firmly into the nursery. Hook is an Etonian, a dandy, absurd and menacing at once, pursued by a crocodile with a clock in it. From that point, the pirate is a children's figure, a costume, a birthday party theme, and the actual gallows at Wapping recede into a fog. Howard Pyle's illustrations in the same period fixed the look permanently. The headscarf, the sash, the boots, the earring, the buried chest on a moonlit beach. Pyle was working from the general history and from his own imagination, and he was a superb artist, and the world has essentially been drawing his pirates ever since. Then film. Douglas Fairbanks in 1926. Errol Flynn in Captain Blood in 1935, adapted from Raphael Sabatini's novel, which itself borrowed heavily from Henry Morgan. Robert Newton's Voice in 1950, and in 2003, a film based on a theme park ride, which is a marvelous piece of cultural recursion, since the ride had itself been built from the films. The Pirates of the Caribbean series is often criticized by historians for its inaccuracy, and it is wildly inaccurate. But it is worth noticing what it got right almost by accident. The crews are polyglot and multinational. The captains are precarious and can be removed. There is constant talk of the code and of shares. Ships are stolen, lost, careened, and stolen again. Beneath the sea monsters, there is a real memory of how these companies actually worked. Meanwhile, slowly and much more quietly, the actual evidence has been coming up out of the sand. The single most important pirate archaeological site in the world lies off Wellfleet on Cape Cod. In April 1717, a ship called the Wider Galley, a slave vessel captured a few weeks earlier by a young pirate named Samuel Bellamy, was driven ashore in a violent nor'easter and destroyed. Almost the entire company died, over 140 men. 2 survived and were tried in Boston. Bellamy himself is a striking figure. He was from Devon, he was about 28, and he was known as Black Sam, reportedly for wearing his own dark hair, long and unpowdered, rather than adopting a wig. Captain Johnson's account gives him a speech delivered to a captured merchant captain, in which he says that the difference between them is that the merchant robs the poor under cover of law, while he plunders the rich under the protection of his own courage, and that he would rather be a free prince than a sneaking puppy who submits to laws men made for their own security. It may be entirely invented. It is the closest thing the Golden Age has to a manifesto, and it has been quoted approvingly by people who would have been horrified by Bellamy in person. The Wider wreck was located in 1984 by Barry Clifford after years of searching, and the site is confirmed beyond doubt because the ship's bell was recovered with her name and the date 1696 cast into it. That is exceptionally rare. Almost no pirate wreck can be positively identified. The site has produced tens of thousands of objects: gold and silver coins of many nations, gold dust from West Africa, jewelry, cannon, navigational instruments, shoes, buttons, pistols, cufflinks, and, at the center of it, human remains, including the leg bone of a child inside a shackle. The Wider was a slave ship before Bellamy took her, and the archaeology has become as much a record of the transatlantic slave trade as of piracy, which is precisely as it should be. The Queen Anne's Revenge site off Beaufort has produced a comparable body of material. The recovery of medical instruments, ordinary tableware, weights, tools, and 30-odd cannon, most of them loaded, has done more to describe the physical reality of Blackbeard's ship than 3 centuries of storytelling. There are museums now, in Nassau, in St. Augustine, on Cape Cod, in Beaufort. Port Royal's drowned streets are protected. Divers work under permit. Conservation of iron recovered from seawater takes years of careful electrolysis before an object can even be looked at properly, which is a discipline that would have baffled every man in this story. And there is one more legacy, less obvious and rather more serious. The suppression of Golden Age piracy produced the first genuine attempt at a universal international criminal jurisdiction. The pirate became, in legal theory, hostis humani generis, the enemy of all mankind, a person any nation could try, regardless of where the offense occurred or whose ship it was. That concept, worked out in the Admiralty courts of the 1720s, is a direct ancestor of the modern law of universal jurisdiction that underpins international prosecution of certain crimes today. The men on that beach at Nassau, who could not have cared less about jurisprudence, are in the footnotes of it. So why do they hold us? I have thought about this a good deal while putting tonight together, and I do not think it is the treasure. Treasure is easy to imagine, and rather boring once you have it. I think it is the shape of the life. Almost everyone who has ever lived has lived inside a structure they did not choose. A trade, a household, a village, a rank, a wage. For most of human history, the question of what you would do with your life was answered before you were old enough to ask it. That is still truer today than we like to admit. Most of us are, in some fashion, working a ship we did not build for cargo that is not ours. And here is a small group of people, at the bottom of the most rigid hierarchy of their age, who stepped off, who said, in effect, that the terms were not acceptable and that they would rather take their chances. Who then, having stepped off, built something with rules of their own, elected their leaders, wrote down what a man's arm was worth, and voted on where to go next. They were not good people. Many of them were thieves, and some were murderers, and a number of them did things that no amount of context excuses. They stole from ordinary sailors as often as from rich merchants. They participated in the slave trade. Their freedom was purchased with other people's misery, which is exactly what they claim to object to. But the impulse underneath, the refusal, is one that almost everybody recognizes. That is why the story survives. Not because we want to rob anyone, but because somewhere in most people there is a small, quiet, entirely unacted upon wish to stop asking permission. They paid an enormous price for it. 2 years, on average. Then the rope, or the water, which is perhaps the real lesson, and it is a gentler one than it sounds. The pirates were right that the world was unfair and wrong about what to do with that knowledge. Their answer was to take by force what they were denied, and it destroyed nearly every one of them within a few seasons. The men who lived were mostly the ones who found some quieter way through. There is a version of that choice in most lives, made in far smaller ways, and hardly any of it involves a ship. Let the picture come back one more time now, and then we will let it go. It is very late in the Caribbean, and the moon has come up. Not full, 3/4 perhaps, high enough to have taken the color out of everything and turned the sea to hammered silver. There is a single sloop standing south under easy sail, no lights showing, her canvas pale, and her hull almost black against the water. She is not hurrying. There is nowhere left to hurry to. Her wake spreads out behind her in 2 long lines that catch the moonlight and then fade, and in the disturbed water there is a faint green glow of phosphorescence that comes and goes. A man is at her tiller with a star held on the edge of her bowsprit, and he has been standing there for 2 hours without saying anything. On the deck behind him, a dozen men are asleep on the planking, with their coats rolled under their heads. The rigging makes its small, regular sounds. A block turns over somewhere and stops. Ahead of her, a low island, palms leaning all one way, the way palms do where the trade wind never stops. The reef showing as a thin line of white with the moon on it. Behind the reef, water so still and shallow that the moon is in it twice. And she runs on south, getting smaller, until the sail is a pale mark and then a smudge, and then nothing at all, and the sea closes over where she was without any fuss, and the swell goes on rolling west, the way it did before anyone came, and the palms keep moving in the warm wind, and the reef keeps up its low, patient murmur, and the stars turn slowly over the whole quiet Caribbean, as though none of it ever happened. The sea does not remember them. It never remembers anyone. That is not cruelty. It is simply what the sea is. And there is a strange comfort in it, because it means that whatever you are carrying tonight will also, eventually, be laid down and washed over and let go. Thank you for coming with me tonight. Genuinely thank you. Whether you have been here for the whole journey or drifted off somewhere around Tortuga and are only surfacing now for a moment, I am very glad you spent these hours here. If you enjoyed it, a like and a subscribe helps more than you would think. And if you would like more of this, there is the book, Sleep into Power, on Amazon, and the whole channel on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for listening in the dark, and Meditate into Power for the nights when you want no story at all, and the Buy Me a Coffee page for anyone who feels moved to. But right now, none of that matters. What matters is that you let your shoulders drop, let the last of the day go, let the breath get slow and even and unremarkable. You have nowhere to be and nothing to solve until morning. The sea is calm, the wind is warm, the stars are out over the water, and they will still be there tomorrow. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.